Before they belonged to history, they belonged only to the quiet, dusty dusk of a Georgia summer. If you were to stand there, at the edge of the woods just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, you would hear the crickets beginning their evening song. You would feel the thick, sweet heat of the southern air, heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp red earth. And you would see them. Not as legends, not as monuments of bronze or figures in a textbook, but simply as boys. Young men, barely out of their childhoods, stepping off trains and buses, carrying worn cardboard suitcases and canvas duffel bags, stepping into a world they could not yet understand. They came from everywhere, pulled like leaves in a gentle stream toward this one, quiet place. There were farm boys whose hands were already rough from years of pulling plows across the quiet plains of the Midwest. There were city kids from the crowded, clamoring streets of New York and Philadelphia, boys who had never seen a night sky completely free of city lights. There were miners' sons from Pennsylvania, and high school athletes, and quiet readers, and boisterous dreamers. They were strangers, separated by geography, by class, by the entirely different lives they had known just a few weeks before. Yet, as they stood together in the fading golden light, the red dust of Georgia settling on their polished shoes, those differences began to quietly slip away, dissolving into the warm evening air. Looming over them, a silent sentinel in the twilight, was the mountain. Kahi. It is a beautiful word, an old word, meaning stands alone. In the days and weeks that followed, that mountain would become their entire world. It was not a battlefield, but it was the place where they would fight their first, quietest wars, the wars within themselves. Imagine the mornings, long before the sun had even thought to rise. The air is still cool, holding the gentle mist of the night. The stillness is broken by the sharp, sudden blare of a bugle, but even that harsh sound softens as it echoes through the heavy trees. Then comes the rustle of hundreds of men moving in the dark. The soft thud of boots hitting wooden floorboards. The whispering of canvas and wool as uniforms are hastily pulled on. There is a groggy, shared silence among them, a language of tired sighs and rubbed eyes. And then, they run. 3 miles up the mountain, 3 miles down. At first, it is a chaos of gasping breath and aching muscles. It is a lonely struggle. Each boy feels the burning in his own lungs, the heavy, sinking weight in his own legs. But as the days turn into weeks, a subtle, beautiful rhythm begins to emerge. The chaotic slapping of boots on the dirt path synchronizes into a steady, hypnotic heartbeat. Thud. 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 It is on that winding, dusty road up the mountain that the truest magic of this story begins. It does not happen in a flash of glory. It happens in the smallest, most easily forgotten moments. A boy from Brooklyn stumbles, his legs finally giving out, his lungs burning for air. He is ready to quit, ready to let the mountain win. But before his knees can touch the dirt, a strong, calloused hand reaches out. It is a boy from the wheat fields of Kansas. He doesn't say a word. He simply grips the city boy's arm, pulls him upright, and matches his stride. He offers a steady shoulder, a shared breath, a silent promise. I am here. We are doing this together. I will not let you fall. In that fleeting exchange of sweat and exhaustion, a bond is forged that is stronger than steel. They are no longer strangers. They are becoming something else, something deeply entwined. They are becoming brothers. When the sun finally sets on the camp, bringing a merciful end to the heat and the exertion, a profound quiet settles over the wooden barracks. This is the time when the bravado of the day melts away, leaving only the tender, vulnerable hearts of young men far from home. Picture a single, dim flashlight glowing under a wool blanket. A young soldier lies on his stomach, a cheap fountain pen in his hand, a sheet of thin paper resting on his canvas pack. He is trying to write a letter to his mother. He chews on the end of the pen, searching for the right words. He doesn't write about the pain in his blistered feet or the terrifying, exhausting runs up the mountain. He doesn't write about the creeping fear of what the future holds. Instead, he writes about the gentle southern rain. He writes about the boy in the bunk next to him who tells funny stories about a dog back in Chicago. He writes, "I am eating well, Ma. Don't worry about me. I am making good friends." He folds the paper carefully, sealing inside it a silent, desperate wish for the comfort of his childhood kitchen, the smell of his mother's cooking, the safety of the world he left behind. All down the row of bunks, similar letters are being penned in the quiet dark. Tiny, fragile bridges of ink and paper, connecting this strange, dusty camp to front porches and living rooms across the country. The darkness of the barracks is filled with the soft symphony of sleep. The rhythmic breathing of a dozen men, the occasional shift of a body on a thin mattress, the gentle creak of wooden springs. Sometimes, a voice murmurs in the dark, caught in the grip of a dream. And sometimes, two boys who cannot sleep will sit on the edge of their bunks, their voices drop to the softest of whispers so as not to wake the others. They talk about sweethearts, pulling creased, black and white photographs from their wallets to show off smiles frozen in time. They talk about the cars they want to buy when this is all over, the jobs they want to have, the lives they want to build. They talk to keep the quiet fear at bay. Because hovering just beneath the surface of their conversations, hanging in the air like the humid Georgia mist, is the reality of what they have volunteered to do. They are paratroopers. The very word holds a strange, terrifying magic. It means they will be asked to step out of a perfectly good airplane into the empty, rushing sky. It means they will have nothing but a canopy of silk and the grace of the wind to carry them down to the earth. It is a terrifying thought to hold in the quiet of the night. But when the fear begins to creep in, chilling the edges of their minds, they look across the aisle. They see the outline of the boy from Kansas, the boy from Brooklyn, the boy from the coal mines. They hear the steady, reassuring sound of their breathing. And the fear subsides, just a little. They realize, perhaps without even finding the words for it, that they are not alone. Whatever sky they must fall from, whatever dark woods they must land in, they will not do it by themselves. They have given themselves to each other. In the mess hall, the simple act of sharing a meal becomes a quiet communion. The clatter of tin cups and the murmur of easy conversation fill the room. The food is plain, often tasteless, but it is shared. A piece of stale bread is broken in half and offered to a friend. A canteen of tepid water is passed down the line, tasting sweeter than any wine because it is given with a nod of understanding. They learn the intricate landscapes of each other's faces. They learn who laughs the loudest, who stays quiet when he is sad, who needs a gentle joke to lift his spirits, and who just needs someone to sit beside him in silence. They learn to read the slight droop of a shoulder, the tired shadow beneath an eye. They become caretakers of each other's spirits. When one man's boots are worn through, causing his heels to bleed, another quietly slips him a precious scrap of moleskin, asking for nothing in return. When the rain pours down, turning the Georgia red clay into a thick, clinging mud, they huddle together under canvas ponchos, sharing the meager warmth of their bodies, finding comfort in the simple friction of shoulder against shoulder. This is the alchemy of the mountain. It takes the soft clay of their youth, the disparate, unshaped pieces of their individual lives, and presses them together under the immense weight of shared struggle. It is not the harsh discipline that binds them, nor is it the abstract idea of a distant war. It is the blistered feet. It is the aching muscles. It is the shared cup of water and the whispered secret in the night. As the summer weeks drift by, the seasons slowly beginning to turn, you can see the change in them. The hesitation in their steps is gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded grace. The boys who arrived with cardboard suitcases and wide, uncertain eyes have vanished into the shadows of the pine trees. In their place are men. They stand a little taller, but not with arrogance. They stand with the quiet, unshakable confidence of those who have looked at their own limits and pushed past them, not alone, but together. When they look up at the mountain now, it is no longer a looming adversary. It is a monument to their own endurance. They have conquered the slopes of Kahi, but more importantly, they have conquered the lonely islands of themselves. The war is still a distant thunder, a storm gathering on a horizon they cannot yet see. The battlefields of Europe are just abstract names on maps. But whatever is coming, whatever unimaginable trials wait for them across the dark ocean, they face it with a profound, quiet strength. They have woven their lives together so tightly that you can no longer tell where one man's courage ends and another's begins. They are a single, breathing entity, bound by an invisible thread of absolute trust. As the last light of the Georgia sun fades, painting the sky in soft strokes of violet and bruised gold, the camp settles down once more. The crickets resume their song. The wind whispers softly through the tops of the ancient pines. The boys sleep, their breathing synchronized, their hearts beating in the same steady rhythm. They rest in the deep, comforting embrace of brotherhood, wrapped in the quiet shadows of the mountain, ready for the morning, ready for the sky, and ready for whatever the world will ask of them tomorrow. There is a specific kind of silence that belongs only to the middle of the ocean, where the world you knew is gone, and the world you are going to is still just a shadow in the mist. When the young men stepped off the solid, familiar earth of America and onto the cold steel of the troopships, they were stepping out of time itself. The journey across the vast, gray expanse of the Atlantic was not measured in miles, but in the slow, hypnotic rhythm of the ship's engines. Deep in the iron belly of the vessel, the thrumming was a constant, steady heartbeat, vibrating through the metal decks and into the soles of their boots. It was a lullaby of machinery, rocking them into a strange, suspended reality. The ocean was immense, an endless canvas of restless water that stretched out to meet a sky of identical gray. For boys who had grown up surrounded by cornfields, or hemmed in by the brick and mortar of city streets, this much open space was dizzying. It made them feel impossibly small. They were just a tiny, floating island of humanity, adrift in a universe of salt and wind. Life below deck was a crowded, dim maze of canvas bunks stacked high into the shadows. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, canvas, and the sharp tang of sea salt. It was cramped, and the constant, rolling pitch of the waves brought a heavy, sweeping wave of seasickness to many. Yet, even in this discomfort, the quiet brotherhood they had forged on the mountain continued to bloom. You could see it in the dim light, a young man from the Midwest, his own face pale, gently holding a tin cup of fresh water to the lips of a city boy who was too weak to lift his head. You could hear it in the soft, reassuring murmurs traded in the dark, the simple presence of a friend in the bunk below, offering a quiet anchor in the swaying room. At night, those who could brave the chill would quietly make their way up to the open deck. Up there, the wind was sharp and clean, washing away the stagnant air of the hold. They would stand at the railing, their collars pulled up high against the cold, and look out at the black water breaking against the hull into a million glowing white fragments. They looked up at the stars, finding comfort in the fact that it was the exact same sky that was currently draped over their homes in Pennsylvania, or Oregon, or Texas. In those quiet, starlit moments, leaning against the cold iron, they wondered who they were going to be when their boots finally touched the ground again. They were suspended between the boys they used to be and the men the world was asking them to become. And then, one pale, misty morning, the endless gray broke. A collective, quiet breath was released as a dark line formed on the horizon, slowly resolving itself into the deep, emerald green of the English coast. England did not look like a world at war. As they boarded trains that gently chugged through the countryside, the young men pressed their faces against the cool glass of the windows, watching a storybook landscape unfold before them. There were rolling hills carpeted in a green so vibrant it almost hurt the eyes. There were ancient stone walls winding endlessly over the landscape, flocks of sheep grazing peacefully in the mist, and quaint farmhouses with thick thatched roofs. It was a gentle, sleepy world, wrapped in a soft, perpetual drizzle that seemed to quiet all the loud noises of their military lives. They were billeted in a small, ancient village, a place where the roads were paved with uneven cobblestones and the air always smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. For the locals, the arrival of these loud, energetic Americans was a sudden burst of life. But for the soldiers, the village offered something deeply precious, a quiet domesticity they had desperately missed. The contrast was beautiful and tender. Here were these young paratroopers, trained to fall from the sky and endure the harshest conditions, sitting awkwardly in tiny parlors with elderly English women who served them hot tea in delicate china cups. The boys would reach into their olive-dry pockets and pull out treasures, bars of sweet chocolate and sticks of chewing gum, handing them to the wide-eyed village children who trailed behind them like shadows. In the simple exchange of a shy smile, or the warm offering of a baked potato from a meager ration, the soldiers found a fleeting, comforting reminder of the mothers, sisters, and younger brothers they had left behind. But beneath the idyllic surface of the village, a heavy, quiet anticipation began to settle into their bones. They were there to wait. And waiting, they soon learned, was a deeply exhausting kind of work. The days fell into a rhythm of endless rehearsals. They marched through the muddy lanes, they studied maps until their eyes ached, and they jumped from plains over the quiet English downs, their silk parachutes blooming like giant, silent white flowers against the overcast sky. They practiced the motions of survival until their bodies moved without thinking. But it was the quiet hours, the unstructured time when the drills were over, that the weight of their purpose truly settled upon them. When the damp English evening crept in, wrapping the village in shadows, the men would gather in the local pub. The room would glow with a warm, amber light. The air would fill with the murmur of voices, the clinking of thick glass mugs, and the soft, scratching sound of matches striking to light cigarettes. They did not talk about the looming invasion. They did not speak of the map coordinates or the drop zones. Instead, they leaned against the dark wooden bar and talked about everything else. They talked about baseball. They talked about the girls they hoped to marry. They sang songs in quiet, harmony-rich voices, trying to hold onto the lightness of their youth for just a little longer. In that warm room, surrounded by the familiar faces of their brothers, they built a temporary fortress against the unknown. When they returned to their cold, arched metal huts at night, the truest, most private moments of the waiting unfolded. Picture a young man sitting on the edge of his cot. The only light comes from a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. He has a piece of thin, crinkling airmail paper resting on a wooden clipboard on his knees. He is holding a fountain pen, watching the ink gather at the tip, trying to find the words. He wants to tell his family how deeply he misses them, how the smell of the damp earth here reminds him of the garden back home, how he sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night with a hollow ache in his chest. But he knows his words will travel thousands of miles to sit on a kitchen table, and he cannot bear to send them his fear. So, he writes with a quiet, protective love. He writes, "The country here is very pretty. The people are kind. Do not worry about me. I am with good men." He writes to his sweetheart, tracing her name on the envelope with a soft, lingering touch. Sometimes, a soldier will open a letter he has read a dozen times before, holding the paper close to his face, closing his eyes just to catch the fading, ghost-like scent of her perfume. These fragile squares of paper are their lifelines, thin threads of ink and memory anchoring them to a world of peace, a world they are waiting to fight for. As the weeks slowly turned into months, the seasons shifted. The heavy, dark winter gave way to a hesitant, blooming spring. The leaves returned to the ancient oak trees, and the air grew warmer. But with the clearing skies came a thickening, unspoken dread. They all knew the waiting was coming to an end. You could feel it in the air, heavy and electric, like the moments right before a thunderstorm breaks. They began to look at each other differently. The glances held a little longer. The casual brushing of a hand on a shoulder carried a deeper, silent weight. They were memorizing each other. They were looking at the boy from Kansas, the boy from Brooklyn, the boy from the coal mines, and quietly acknowledging the profound, terrifying reality that the next time they stepped into an airplane, they would not be coming back to this quiet village. The practice was over. Yet, There was no panic. There was only that quiet, sweeping resilience they had built together on the dusty mountain in Georgia, now refined by the damp cold of England. They had become a single breathing organism. If one man felt his courage faltering, he only had to look across the room to see his brother calmly shining his boots or quietly folding his uniform, and the fear would retreat back into the shadows. On one of those final, quiet nights, the rain began to fall again. It was a gentle, rhythmic patter against the curved tin roof of the barracks. The sound was deeply soothing, a natural lullaby that had sung them to sleep countless times before. Inside the hut, the stove radiated a small, comforting heat. The men were in their bunks, wrapped in thick wool blankets. Listen to the steady, collective breathing of the room. It is the sound of absolute trust. It is the sound of young men who have surrendered their individual fears to the collective strength of the group. As the rain washes over the quiet English countryside, softening the edges of the world, they drift into sleep. They do not know what tomorrow will bring. They do not know what the darkness across the channel holds. But in this moment, under the gentle drumming of the rain, they are warm. They are together. And for one more quiet night, they are safe. The sky did not look like a battlefield, it looked like a vast, breathing ocean of black glass, quietly waiting to catch them. If you were sitting in the belly of that metal ship, high above the dark water of the channel, you would feel the deep, hypnotic thrum of the engines vibrating right through the soles of your heavy boots. The noise inside the cabin was a constant, steady roar, a heavy blanket of sound that wrapped around the men and swallowed their words. But within that deafening noise, there was a profound and absolute silence. The men sat in two long rows, facing each other in the dim, trembling twilight of the fuselage. They were so laden with gear, so wrapped in canvas, webbing, and heavy wool, that they could barely move. They looked like deep-sea divers preparing to sink into the unknown. Their faces were painted with burnt cork and dark grease, turning them into shadows, erasing the farm boys and the city kids, leaving only the white of their wide, unblinking eyes. Look at the boy sitting near the door. His hands are resting on his knees. They are trembling, just a little. He tries to rub the cold sweat from his palms onto the rough fabric of his trousers, but the dampness remains. He feels a heavy, sinking weight in his chest, a knot of quiet terror that he swallows down again and again. He is so far from home. He closes his eyes and tries to picture the front porch of his house, the way the screen door squeaked in the summer breeze, the smell of his mother's bread cooling on the counter. He tries to hold onto that warmth, packing it tightly into the corners of his heart to keep the freezing altitude from seeping in. He opens his eyes and looks across the narrow aisle. The boy sitting opposite him catches his gaze. Beneath the dark streaks of camouflage paint, a familiar, gentle smile appears. The friend slowly reaches across the shaking floorboards and rests a heavy, gloved hand on the trembling knee. He doesn't say a word. The roar of the engines would steal the words anyway. He just leaves his hand there for a long, quiet moment. In that simple, grounding touch, the terror begins to recede. It is replaced by a soft, glowing ember of resolve. They are tied to one another. Whatever happens when they step out into the dark, they will not be alone. Suddenly, the red light near the open door blinks on. It casts a harsh, crimson glow over the rows of faces. The time for waiting has vanished. The men stand. The movement is slow, heavy, a clumsy dance in the cramped space. They hook their static lines to the anchor cable above their heads. The metal clips slide along the wire with a sharp, rhythmic clatter, a sound that cuts right through the drone of the engines. They check their equipment, their hands moving with the practiced grace of 100 rehearsals back in the quiet English valleys. They check the man in front of them, tugging on canvas straps, a final, physical reassurance of the bond they share. Then, the light turns green. It happens so fast, yet in the memory of the men, it unfolds in a strange, floating slow motion. They shuffle forward. The cold night air rushes in through the open door, bringing with it the damp, earthy scent of the French coast far below. When the boy reaches the edge, he does not look down. He simply steps forward, surrendering himself to the rushing wind. The slipstream hits him like a physical wall, throwing him out into the vast, freezing dark. There is a violently chaotic second of tumbling, a rush of sound and dizzying motion. And then, a sharp, sudden pull. Above him, the silk canopy blossoms into the night sky, catching the air with a deep, reassuring snap. And then, everything stops. The roaring engines of the planes fade away into a distant, muffled hum. The violent rushing of the wind disappears. In its place is a silence so deep, so absolute, it feels almost holy. He is suspended in the air, hanging by thin white threads between the heavens and the earth. He is floating, drifting as gently as a dandelion seed caught in a midnight breeze. For a few precious seconds, the war does not exist. There is only the cool wind on his face, the soft creak of the canvas harness, and the breathtaking, surreal beauty of the night. He looks down. Below him, the patchwork fields of Normandy are bathed in a pale, ghostly moonlight. The winding rivers look like ribbons of silver. Then, the darkness below begins to sparkle. Slowly at first, then faster, delicate streams of light begin to float up from the earth. They are glowing embers of red and green, drifting upward in graceful, sweeping arcs. To the boy hanging in the sky, they do not look like weapons. They look like fireflies. They look like strings of glowing pearls, weaving beautiful, deadly patterns through the dark. It is a mesmerizing, terrifying light show, silently painting the sky around him. He watches the colored lights drift past his boots, completely powerless, simply a passenger on the wind. The ground rises up from the shadows to meet him faster than he expects. The silver moonlight gives way to the dark shapes of tall trees and thick hedges. He braces his legs, entirely blind to what lies beneath him. With a sudden, heavy jolt, he crashes into the earth. He rolls through the damp, tall grass, the air knocked from his lungs. The heavy silk parachute collapses around him, draping over the weeds like a dying ghost. For a moment, he simply lies there in the wet dirt, trying to catch his breath. The smell of the earth is overwhelming, rich, damp, and ancient. He scrambles to unbuckle his harness, his fingers fumbling awkwardly with the cold metal clasps. He shucks the heavy canvas off his shoulders and crawls toward the deep shadow of a thick, towering hedge. He presses his back against the twisted roots, clutching his rifle to his chest, and forces himself to be perfectly still. He listens. The silence of the French countryside is heavy and thick. It is no longer the peaceful silence of the sky. It is a holding breath silence. A waiting silence. He hears the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. He hears a single cricket chirping in the tall grass. And he realizes, with a sudden, icy wash of dread, that he is completely, utterly alone. The brothers who had sat beside him in the plane, the men whose breathing he had synchronized his own life to, are gone. Scattered to the winds. Dropped into the endless, confusing maze of darkness. He does not know where he is. He does not know where the enemy is. He is just a boy, sitting in the damp dirt of a foreign country, shrouded in shadows. The loneliness is a physical weight, heavier than the gear strapped to his back. He feels a desperate, aching need to hear a familiar voice, to see a face that he knows. Slowly, carefully, he reaches into the breast pocket of his uniform. His trembling fingers wrap around a tiny piece of brass. It is a toy, a simple metal clicker shaped like a cricket, handed out just days before with a solemn promise. He takes a slow, shaky breath. He presses the metal strip. Click-clack. The sound is impossibly loud in the still night. It seems to echo off the leaves, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. He holds his breath. He waits. The silence stretches out, thin and fragile. The wind whispers through the branches above him. His heart hammers a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The fear begins to rise in his throat again. He is alone. No one heard him. He grips the brass toy tighter, preparing to press it once more, when he hears it. From the shadows across the narrow dirt path, a sound floats back through the dark. Click-clack. Click-clack. The boy exhales, a long, shuddering breath that carries away the worst of the terror. He raises his head, peering into the impenetrable gloom. A shadow detaches itself from the darker mass of the trees. It moves slowly, carefully, keeping low to the ground. As the figure steps into a pale sliver of moonlight, the boy sees the familiar silhouette of a helmet, the bulky outline of the canvas jumpsuit. He whispers a name into the dark. The figure pauses, then turns. A whispered voice calls back, carrying the soft, unmistakable drawl of the American South. It is the boy from the plane. The boy who had rested a hand on his knee. They move toward each other, stumbling in the thick grass, until they are close enough to reach out and touch. They do not embrace. They do not cheer. They simply grasp each other by the shoulders, their hands gripping the rough wool tightly. In the pale moonlight, beneath the smeared black paint, the boy can see the profound, overwhelming relief in his friend's eyes. It is a mirror of his own soul. In that quiet, dark orchard, surrounded by thousands of miles of hostile territory, the universe has suddenly been set right. The terrifying, crushing weight of the unknown is still out there, hiding behind the hedgerows and waiting in the dark. But it no longer matters in the same way. The terrible spell of isolation has been broken. They sink down together into the tall, wet grass, leaning their backs against the same ancient tree. They share a canteen, the cool water tasting sweeter than anything they have ever known. They do not speak of the glowing embers in the sky, or the violent jump, or the fear that had almost consumed them. They sit shoulder to shoulder, listening to the crickets, drawing quiet strength from the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man beside them. The night is still dark. The journey has only just begun. But as they sit there in the shadows, waiting for the dawn to slowly paint the horizon, they know the most important truth of the long road ahead. They have found each other in the dark. And as long as they are together, they can face whatever the morning light will bring. When the first pale light of morning finally bled through the canopy, it did not bring clarity, it only painted the confusion in shades of soft, damp green. If you had been there, waking up in the tall, wet grass of the French countryside, the first thing you would have noticed was the smell. It was a rich, heavy scent, a mixture of crushed clover, ancient turned earth, and the sweet, lingering mist that had settled over the fields during the night. The air was cool and thick, clinging to the heavy wool of the uniforms, leaving a delicate layer of silver dew on the cold steel of the rifles that lay resting across sleeping chests. As the boys slowly opened their eyes, blinking away the exhaustion of the jump and the terrors of the dark, they found themselves in a world that felt entirely disconnected from the wide-open skies they had fallen through just hours before. The horizon had vanished. In its place were the hedgerows. To call them mere bushes would be to misunderstand the very landscape of Normandy. These were towering, ancient walls of earth and intertwined roots, some of them older than the countries these young men had come from. They rose up 10, sometimes 15 feet high, forming a dense, impenetrable fortress of briars, hawthorn, and thick oak vines. They turned the rolling farmland into a dizzying, suffocating maze. You could not see what was in the next field. You could barely see what was 20 yards down the sunken dirt lane. The world had suddenly shrunk. It was no longer a vast theater of global conflict. It was only this wall of green leaves, the muddy ditch beneath it, and the quiet, nervous breathing of the boy kneeling beside you. The mornings in the hedgerows were surreal in their beauty. Golden beams of sunlight would eventually pierce the morning fog, catching the dust and the pollen in the air, creating soft, ethereal pillars of light in the sunken lanes. Somewhere in the distance, a cow might low softly, a profoundly gentle, domestic sound that seemed absurdly out of place. It was a beautiful, sleepy countryside, designed for quiet walks and slow, peaceful farming. But for the paratroopers, this profound quiet was heavy with an agonizing anticipation. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig, carried a sudden spike of adrenaline. The silence was not empty, it was deeply, precariously full. It was the holding of a collective breath. Look at the young soldier crouched at the base of the earth wall. His helmet is tipped slightly back, revealing a forehead smeared with dark mud and the exhaustion of a sleepless night. He reaches out with a bare, dirt-stained hand and touches the thick, knotted roots protruding from the dirt. The wood is damp and cool. He traces the rough bark with his fingertips, grounding himself in the simple, physical reality of the earth. He is trying to quiet the frantic beating of his own heart. He knows that soon, he will have to stand up. He knows that someone has to be the first to peer through the gaps in the hawthorn, the first to step out of the shadows of the sunken lane and into the terrifying vulnerability of the open grass. In the movies, bravery is always loud. It is a booming shout, a fearless charge, a sweeping gesture of invincibility. But in the damp, quiet shadows of the French hedgerows, true bravery looked entirely different. True bravery was almost invisible. It was the boy from a quiet farm in the Midwest, his own hands shaking slightly, catching the eye of the terrified kid from a noisy city block. It was a soft, almost imperceptible nod. It was the whisper, barely louder than the breeze moving through the leaves, "I'll go first. Just stay close." It was the profound, everyday heroism of putting one heavy boot in front of the other, not out of a desire for glory, but simply because the man beside you needed you to move. They were propelled forward by a quiet, invisible web of loyalty, a shared promise that they would not leave each other behind in this endless, green labyrinth. When they finally moved, they moved like ghosts. They learned to walk softly, to place their boots carefully on the soft mud to avoid the dry, snapping branches. They communicated in a new, silent language. A raised hand to halt. A pointed finger. A wide-eyed glance that said, "Listen." The physical toll of navigating the maze was immense. The thick wool uniforms, designed to keep them warm in the freezing altitudes of the sky, now trapped the humid summer heat. Sweat stung their eyes and cut clean lines through the dirt on their cheeks. The heavy canvas webbing of their gear dug deep into their tired shoulders. Yet, whenever they found a momentary sanctuary, a small clearing, a deep crater, or a thick, protective corner of roots, the deep well of their brotherhood offered the only true relief. Imagine a brief pause in the midday heat. 3 young men are slumped together against a dirt bank. One of them slowly reaches into one of his many pockets. His fingers are stiff and sore, but he moves with delicate care. He pulls out a small, foil-wrapped square from his rations. A piece of hard, bitter chocolate. It is barely a mouthful, and he has not eaten a real meal in over 2 days. But he does not eat it. He carefully snaps the small square into 3 uneven pieces. He hands one to the boy on his left, whose eyes are closed in exhaustion, and one to the boy on his right, who takes it with a quiet, solemn nod of thanks. They let the chocolate melt slowly on their tongues, savoring the tiny burst of energy, the fleeting reminder of sweetness in a world that had suddenly become so harsh. It is a communion of dust and sugar. In that simple, selfless sharing of a fractured ration, there is more love and humanity than any monument could ever capture. In these quiet, stolen moments behind the green walls, the mind inevitably drifted backward, carried away from the war by the scent of the damp earth or the shape of a passing cloud. Another soldier sits with his knees pulled tightly to his chest. He reaches beneath the canvas fabric of his jacket, right over his heart, and withdraws a small, folded piece of paper. The edges are soft and frayed from being endlessly handled. It is a letter from his wife, written weeks ago, in a kitchen thousands of miles away. He doesn't need to read it, he has memorized every loop and slant of her handwriting. But he unfolds it anyway, just to look at the ink. He stares at the paper, letting the chaotic, muddy world of the hedgerows fade away. For just a minute, he is standing on a worn rug in a quiet hallway. He can smell coffee brewing. He can hear the soft, familiar sound of her voice singing along to the radio. He holds the letter to his nose, closing his eyes, desperately searching for a trace of her perfume, but he smells only his own sweat, the cordite from his rifle, and the relentless, earthy smell of France. He folds the letter back into a tiny square, tucks it safely against his chest, and takes a slow, deep breath. The letter is his armor. It is the reason he will stand up again when the whisper comes to move forward. The days in the maze blurred together, marked only by the shifting angle of the sun and the ever-present shadows of the leaves. There were moments of sudden, shattering noise, terrors that ripped through the foliage and left the men clinging to the dirt, praying to the roots and the stones. But when the noise faded, the quiet always returned, heavier and more profound than before. It was in the aftermath of these moments that the truest measure of their bond was revealed. When the dust settled and the smoke drifted lazily up through the branches, the first thing every man did was look left, and then right. They searched the faces of their brothers. They checked for the familiar shapes, the familiar eyes. If a boy was trembling, unable to stop the violent shaking in his hands, another would quietly slide over to him. He wouldn't offer empty platitudes or loud encouragements. He would simply sit beside him, shoulder to shoulder, letting the solid warmth of his own body act as an anchor. He might pull out a crumpled, half-empty pack of cigarettes, place one between his friend's shaking lips, and strike a match, shielding the tiny flame with a cupped, dirty hand. The glowing tip of the cigarette would illuminate two faces, stripped of all pretense, exhausted and deeply vulnerable. They would share the smoke in silence, watching it curl up toward the sliver of blue sky visible through the branches. The message was unspoken but absolute. You are okay. I am here. We are still here. As evening began to gently pull the sun down behind the great walls of earth, the temperature would drop, and the mist would slowly creep back out of the ground. The men would dig shallow trenches in the soft soil at the base of the roots, preparing for another long, dark night. They would wrap themselves in their thin ponchos, huddling together to share the meager warmth of their tired bodies. The shadows would stretch and deepen, turning the towering bushes into dark, looming silhouettes against the twilight sky. Lying there in the dirt, staring up at the darkening leaves, a profound realization would wash over them. The world they used to know was gone, perhaps forever. The future was an unimaginable distance away, hidden somewhere beyond the endless maze of hawthorn and oak. They only had the present. They only had this damp patch of earth, the cold rifle in their arms, and the breathing of the men lying beside them in the dark. The hedgerows were a crucible that burned away everything that did not matter. What remained was a beautiful, tragic, and enduring purity. It was a love that asked for nothing and offered everything. As the first stars began to cautiously peek through the canopy, the whispers would start again. Soft, murmured conversations traveling down the line of sleeping men. A joke about the terrible rations. A quiet question about the folks back home. A gentle wish for a dry pair of socks. These were the echoes in the hedgerows. Not the sounds of machinery or the grandiose speeches of generals, but the soft, resilient voices of young boys holding onto their humanity in the dark. And as the night fully claimed the French countryside, wrapping them once more in its cool, damp embrace, those whispers slowly faded into the steady, synchronized rhythm of sleep, a quiet chorus of survival, resting before the green walls had to be faced again. There is a profound, aching quiet that settles over a room when someone you love is no longer there to fill it. When the young men finally left the dark, tangled maze of the French hedgerows and crossed the water back to England, they stepped into a world that felt like a beautiful, impossible dream. The gray, stormy skies that had carried them into the night were gone, replaced by the soft, golden warmth of a radiant summer. As their trains chugged slowly through the rolling countryside, they rested their tired heads against the glass, watching the vibrant green hills and the peaceful, grazing sheep drift by. It was the exact same landscape they had left behind, perfectly preserved in its sleepy tranquility. But the boys looking out the windows had entirely changed. Stepping off the trucks and walking back into the quaint, familiar village, the air smelled deeply of blooming jasmine and damp earth. The villagers stood by the cobblestone roads, waving and offering gentle, relieved smiles. The soldiers smiled back, their faces washed clean of the heavy camouflage paint and the thick dust of the continent, but their eyes held a new, unfathomable depth. They moved slower now, not just from the lingering physical exhaustion that settled deep in their bones, but from the invisible, heavy weight they carried in their hearts. They returned to the same metal barracks they had lived in for months, the same curved tin roofs that had sheltered them from the winter rains. But as they pushed open the wooden doors and stepped inside, a sudden, breath-stealing silence washed over them. Before, these long rooms had been bursting with chaotic, nervous energy. They had been filled with the sounds of boots dropping heavily onto wooden floors, the snapping of playing cards, the boisterous arguments about hometown baseball teams, and the constant, comforting hum of 100 voices. Now, the air was still. The sunlight streamed through the small, dusty windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced quietly in the air, falling softly upon rows and rows of neatly made, empty bunks. It is a terrible, sacred thing to look at an empty bed and know the boy who used to sleep there is never coming back. The men walked down the narrow aisles in a hushed, reverent silence. They set their canvas bags down softly, as if afraid to wake a sleeping ghost. A young man from Pennsylvania sat on the edge of his mattress, resting his hands on his knees. He looked across the aisle at the cot opposite his own. The wool blanket was still pulled tight, the edges tucked perfectly into the corners. Underneath the bed, a pair of polished jump boots sat side by side, waiting for feet that would never wear them again. On the small wooden shelf above the pillow rested a half-read paperback novel, a dog-eared page marking a story forever interrupted. The soldier from Pennsylvania did not cry out. He simply reached across the narrow space, his hand trembling slightly, and gently smoothed out an invisible wrinkle on the empty wool blanket. It was a quiet, private gesture of profound love, a silent goodbye spoken into the still, summer air. All down the row, similar quiet moments were unfolding. Men sitting with their heads bowed, touching a forgotten shaving brush, tracing the initials carved into a footlocker, sitting with the heavy, silent weight of surviving. The days that followed were draped in a surreal, dreamlike slowness. There were no urgent drills, no frantic packing of gear, no bugles tearing them from their sleep. There was only the warm breeze drifting through the open doors of the huts, and the endless, stretching hours of the day. Then came the afternoon the mail arrived. For weeks, they had been entirely severed from the world they used to know. Now, a heavy canvas sack was carried into the camp, spilling a mountain of white and blue envelopes onto a wooden table. The men gathered around, their breath catching in their throats, listening for their names to be called. A young boy with tired eyes took his letters and walked away from the group. He found a quiet spot under the wide, shading branches of an ancient oak tree just outside the camp. The grass was cool and soft beneath him. He leaned back against the thick, rough bark, the leaves above him rustling gently in the wind, sounding like a soft, whispered secret. He held a letter from his mother. He traced her handwriting on the envelope, feeling a sudden, desperate lump form in his throat. He carefully slid his thumb under the flap and pulled out the thin paper. As he read her words, the smell of the damp French soil and the sound of the dark night faded away. She wrote about the sweltering heat in the city, the neighbor's new dog that wouldn't stop barking, and how the tomatoes in her small backyard garden were finally starting to turn red. She asked if he was eating enough. She told him to make sure he kept his feet dry. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking innocence. Reading those words, sitting in the dappled sunlight, a silent tear slipped down his cheek, catching in the slight stubble on his chin. He wept not from sorrow, but from the immense, unbridgeable distance that now separated him from the woman who wrote those words. She was living in a world of tomatoes and barking dogs, a world of beautiful, simple peace. He had just returned from a place where the world was broken in half. He realized, with a quiet, lonely ache, that she could never truly understand what he had seen, and he would never, ever want her to. Later that evening, sitting on his bunk in the fading twilight, he pulled out his own pen to write back. He stared at the blank page for a long time. What could he possibly say? He could not write about the terrifying beauty of the night sky, or the shadows in the green maze, or the unbearable silence of the empty cot across the room. He had to protect her from the darkness. He had to be the boy she remembered. So, he wrote with a steady hand. Dear Ma, the weather here in England is beautiful. The summer is very warm. I am eating fine, and my feet are dry. Please save some of those tomatoes for me. Do not worry. I am safe. He folded the paper, sealing his own pain safely inside his heart, building a quiet fortress around the people he loved to keep them untouched by the war. As the summer evening stretched long and golden, the men sought refuge in the quiet corners of the village. The local pub, once a place of raucous laughter and spilled beer, became a hushed sanctuary. The warm, amber light from the lamps cast long shadows against the dark wooden walls. They sat at small, round tables, nursing warm glasses of ale, staring deep into the liquid as if searching for answers at the bottom of the glass. The conversations were sparse, spoken in low, murmuring tones. They didn't talk about what they had done or what they had seen. The memories were too fresh, too sharp to be touched by words. Instead, they communicated in the soft, unseen language of brotherhood that had been forged on the mountain and tested in the dark. A man might notice his friend's shoulders beginning to shake with a silent, invisible tremor. He wouldn't draw attention to it. He wouldn't ask what was wrong. He would simply shift his chair closer, reaching out to rest a heavy, warm hand on the trembling shoulder, leaving it there until the shaking slowly subsided. It was the simple, profound anchor of human touch. I am here. You are not floating away. I know what you are carrying, because I am carrying it too. This was the heaviest burden of the fleeting summer. The survivor's guilt crept in when the sun went down, whispering terrible, unanswerable questions in the dark. Why did I come back? Why am I sitting in this warm pub, listening to the rain on the roof, when he is lying in the cold earth? What makes me so special? There were no answers. There was only the quiet, agonizing realization that they had been spared, and with that sparing came an immense, crushing responsibility. They had to live for the men who couldn't. They had to carry the memories of the boys from Brooklyn, and the farms of Kansas, and the coal mines of Pennsylvania. They became the living monuments to their fallen brothers. As the weeks drifted by, the gentle rhythm of the English countryside slowly began to mend the frayed edges of their spirits. The warm sun baked the lingering chill from their bones. The quiet rustle of the leaves soothed their jumping nerves. They found comfort in the routine of shining their boots, mending their uniforms, and walking along the ancient stone walls that bordered the sheep pastures. They were healing, not by forgetting, but by holding the memories gently in the light. On the final night of the summer, before the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp with the promise of autumn, a profound peace settled over the metal huts. The doors were left open to let in the cool night breeze. The crickets sang their gentle, rhythmic lullaby in the tall grass outside. Listen to the breathing in the room. It is quieter than it was before they left. There are fewer voices to murmur in their sleep, fewer bodies shifting on the squeaking springs. But the breathing that remains is deep, steady, and incredibly strong. The boys who had climbed the dusty mountain in Georgia had been left behind in the dark skies and the green mazes. The men who lay in the bunks now were bound by something stronger than friendship, stronger even than family. They were tethered to one another by the shared weight of survival, by the silent tears shed over letters from home, and by the empty spaces they now guarded in their hearts. As they drifted off to sleep, bathed in the soft, fleeting breath of the summer night, they did not know what the changing season would bring. But they knew, with absolute certainty, that they would face it together. They would carry the shadows of the missing with them, a quiet, protective army of ghosts walking beside them in the sun, ready to step forward once again into whatever the future required. To fall through the sunlight is an entirely different kind of surrender. If you were to close your eyes and imagine the heavy, trembling belly of the transport plane this time, you would not find the suffocating ink of the midnight sky. Instead, you would feel the warm, golden rays of a September afternoon streaming through the small windows, painting long, dusty rectangles of light across the metal floor. The roar of the engines was still there, a constant, steady hum vibrating through the soles of their boots, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a heavy, mechanical lullaby, carrying them over a world bathed in light. They sat in their familiar rows, burdened by the same canvas webbing and heavy wool, but the mood in the cabin had shifted. The crippling, lonely terror of the dark was gone. Now, they could see each other. They could look across the narrow aisle and see the familiar, unpainted faces of their brothers. They could see the boy from the Kansas wheat fields gently tapping his fingers on his knee to a silent tune. They could see the quiet reader from Philadelphia gazing out the open door at the passing clouds, a look of profound, almost sleepy calm in his eyes. They shared small, reassuring smiles, the kind of smiles that speak of a deeply understood, shared history. They were not strangers jumping into an abyss. They were a family, stepping out into the day. When the green light finally flashed, there was no chaotic tumbling into the void. It was a fluid, practiced motion. They stood up in the sunlight, hooked their static lines with a familiar metallic clatter, and simply walked out into the crisp, cool autumn air. The moment they left the plane, the world transformed into a breathtaking masterpiece of moving art. There was the sudden rush of wind, the sharp, reassuring tug on their shoulders, and then, a glorious silence. Above them, the silk canopies blossomed into the pale blue sky, catching the sunlight like giant, floating clouds. But it was not just one parachute. It was thousands. If you looked across the vast expanse of the horizon, the heavens were completely woven with silk. White, green, and vibrant shades of orange drifted down in a beautiful, agonizingly slow descent. It looked as though a sudden wind had swept across a boundless field of dandelions, carrying the delicate seeds up into the calm afternoon sky. Suspended in the quiet air, the boys could hear each other. The deafening roar of the war was replaced by the surreal, echoing voices of young men calling out across the open sky. Someone laughed. Someone yelled a cheerful, teasing greeting to a friend drifting 50 yards away. They hung in their harnesses, swinging gently in the breeze, watching the beautiful, patchwork quilt of the Dutch countryside rise up to meet them. There were no shadows to hide in, no terrifying, unseen corners. There were only flat, emerald green fields, intersected by straight, sparkling ribbons of canals, and the slow, lazy turning of old windmills in the distance. It was a gentle, storybook land, welcoming them with a soft, forgiving embrace. They touched down in the rich, dark soil with a heavy thud, rolling in the grass as the immense silk canopies collapsed softly around them. The smell of the earth here was different from France. It smelled of damp peat, crushed grass, and the faint, sweet scent of autumn. They did not have to crouch in terror, clicking toy crickets in the dark. They simply stood up, unbuckled their harnesses, and looked across the sunlit field. There was the boy from the plane. There was the sergeant. They waved to each other, a simple, relaxed lifting of an arm, and began to walk together through the pasture, gathering their silk and their weapons in a state of quiet, bewildered peace. As they moved away from the drop zone and began to walk down the narrow, brick-paved roads toward the nearby towns, a new, deeply overwhelming experience began to unfold. For months, they had moved through a world that wanted them gone. They had fought through hedgerows and silent, ruined villages where the only greeting was danger. But as they approached the edges of these neat, tidy brick houses, the wooden shutters slowly began to creak open. First, it was just a peek. A pair of cautious, disbelieving eyes peering out from behind a lace curtain. Then, a heavy wooden door opened a crack. And then, as if a dam had burst, the streets suddenly filled with life. The people of the town poured out of their homes. They were wearing clothes that were worn thin at the elbows, their faces pale and drawn from years of hardship and waiting, but their eyes were shining with a brilliant, undeniable light. And everywhere the soldiers looked, they saw the color orange. Orange ribbons were pulled from hidden floorboards and tied hastily into the hair of little girls. Orange armbands, kept secret for years under the threat of death, were proudly slipped onto the sleeves of old men. It was the color of their royal house, the color of their identity, and suddenly, it was blooming across the gray cobblestones like a field of wildflowers. The soldiers stopped, their rifles lowering instinctively, completely disarmed by the tidal wave of pure, unfiltered human emotion washing over them. Imagine a young paratrooper, his shoulders aching from the weight of his gear, standing frozen in the middle of the street. He is approached by an elderly woman. She is wearing a dark, heavy shawl, and her hands are trembling. She does not speak his language. She simply reaches out, her frail, paper-thin hands moving toward his face. He holds perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat, as she gently cups his dirty, unshaven cheeks. Her thumbs brush over his cheekbones. She looks deep into his tired eyes, and a single, heavy tear escapes, tracing a line down her own withered face. She whispers a word in Dutch, a soft, breathy sound that he cannot translate, but that his heart instantly understands. It is a blessing. It is a profound, earth-shattering thank you. The boy feels a sudden tightening in his chest. The tough, unbreakable armor he had built around his heart on the mountain and in the dark forests begins to softly crack, letting the warm light of this stranger's gratitude pour in. He places his own large, calloused hand over hers, holding it against his face for a fleeting, beautiful second, nodding his head in a quiet, mutual understanding. All down the street, these small, miraculous moments of grace were blooming. A little boy, wearing oversized wooden shoes that clattered loudly on the stones, ran up to a tall soldier from the city. The child stopped, looking up with wide, reverent eyes, and slowly extended his small hand. Resting in his palm was a single, slightly bruised apple. It was a meager offering, perhaps the only fresh food the child's family had, but it was given with the solemnity of a king handing over a crown jewel. The soldier, who had eaten nothing but hard, tasteless rations for days, knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. He took the apple gently, as if it were made of fragile glass. He reached into his own canvas pocket, his fingers searching blindly, until he found a small, foil-wrapped square of sweet chocolate. He placed it in the boy's empty hand, closing the small fingers over the foil. The child's face erupted into a smile so pure and bright it seemed to push back the encroaching shadows of the coming evening. Everywhere, the villagers were bringing whatever meager comforts they could find to these boys who had fallen from the sky. Pitchers of cool, fresh well water were passed down the line, tasted from tin cups that were shared among brothers. Small pieces of dark bread were pressed into dirty hands. A woman brought out a basin of warm, soapy water and a clean towel, gently insisting on washing the dirt from the hands of the soldiers who sat resting on her front step. It was a beautiful, overwhelming, chaotic symphony of joy. The air was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of two different languages blending together into a universal song of relief. For the young men of the company, this sudden outpouring of love was deeply humbling. They had been trained to fight. They had been trained to endure pain, to march through exhaustion, to survive the unimaginable. But nothing had prepared them for this. Nothing had prepared them for the overwhelming, staggering weight of what it meant to be a liberator. As they sat on the low brick walls and rested on the wooden benches in the town square, they looked around at the faces of the people. They saw the mothers holding their children a little closer, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, miraculous hope. They saw the old men standing a little taller, their pride restored by the arrival of these strange boys from across the ocean. Sitting there, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and the joyful chatter of the liberated town, the soldiers realized something profound. All the suffering they had endured, the blistering runs up the Georgia mountain, the terrifying, lonely drop into the dark, the unbearable silence of the empty bunks, it had all been leading to this specific moment. They had carried the fire of freedom across the sea, and now they were passing it into the trembling hands of these gentle people. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, the golden light of the sun began to slip below the flat horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows behind the windmills. The joyful chaos of the streets slowly softened into a quiet, deeply settled contentment. The villagers opened their doors, inviting the soldiers into their homes for the night. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the boys did not have to dig a hole in the cold, damp earth to sleep. They were led into small, immaculately clean parlors, where makeshift beds of soft quilts and down pillows had been laid out for them on the wooden floors. Imagine lying down in that quiet room. The windows are open just a crack, letting in the cool, sweet autumn breeze. The sound of the war is entirely gone. There is only the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the friend sleeping on the quilt beside you. The young soldier closes his eyes. He can still feel the soft touch of the old woman's hands on his cheeks. He can still taste the sweet, crisp bite of the bruised apple. He pulls the handmade quilt up to his chin, feeling the warmth of the fabric, a warmth that was stitched with hope and given with love. He knows that tomorrow the march must continue. He knows that the road ahead is long, and that the shadows will inevitably return. But tonight, nestled in the heart of this grateful town, under skies that had rained silk and brought forth tears of joy, he is safe. He is deeply, profoundly loved by people he only met today. And as he drifts into a deep, dreamless sleep, he carries that love with him, a quiet, glowing ember that will keep him warm through all the cold nights yet to come. There is a kind of cold that does not simply touch your skin, but slowly, quietly, settles into the deepest corners of your soul. The golden, sunlit days of their arrival in Holland, with the bright orange ribbons and the joyful tears of the villagers, eventually gave way to the inevitable turning of the earth. Autumn arrived, not with a vibrant display of falling leaves, but with a quiet, sweeping gray that pulled a heavy blanket over the world. The sky lost its brilliant blue, softening into an endless canopy of pale, bruised silver. And then, the rain began to fall. It was not a violent storm. It did not arrive with thunder or the crashing of wind. It was simply a gentle, persistent, never-ending mist that descended upon the flat, low-lying pastures and the winding, swollen rivers of the Dutch countryside. It was a rain that felt incredibly old, weeping softly from the sky day after day, night after night, until the boundaries between the water and the earth simply washed away. For the young men told to hold the line in this sodden landscape, the world shrank to the size of a shallow trench. Digging into the ground was no longer an act of seeking shelter, it was an act of carving out a bathtub in the mud. The earth, usually their steadfast protector, was now a heavy, weeping sponge. As they carved their small homes into the dirt, the dark water would seep up through the roots, pooling around their boots, soaking through the thick leather, and creeping slowly into their heavy wool socks. To live in the rain is to learn a new, exhausting way of being. Everything becomes heavy. The woolen trousers, designed to keep them warm, absorbed the dampness until they felt like lead weights dragging against their tired legs. The canvas of their webbing swelled and stiffened. Their hands, constantly wet and chilled, grew clumsy and pale, their knuckles scraped and raw from the unforgiving terrain. Yet, if you were to walk along that muddy line in the fading, watery twilight, you would not hear shouts of anger. You would not hear the dramatic wailing of broken men. You would only hear the soft, rhythmic drumming of the rain against cold steel helmets, and the gentle, hushed voices of boys finding warmth in the only place left to them, each other. In this beautiful, miserable quiet, true heroism took on a completely different shape. It was no longer about charging across an open field or leaping from an airplane into the dark. Heroism became the simple, agonizing act of staying awake when your eyes burned with exhaustion. It was the quiet resolve to sit in the freezing mud, hour after hour, staring out into the foggy darkness, simply because the brothers sleeping in the dirt behind you trusted you to keep them safe. Imagine the profound, simple luxury of a cup of coffee. Back home, it was something taken for granted, poured from a glass pot in a warm diner, or brewed in a metal percolator on a sunny kitchen stove. But here, in the cold embrace of the Riverlands, a cup of coffee was a sacred, almost impossible miracle. Picture two young soldiers huddled together beneath a single, rubberized poncho. The rain taps a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the taut canvas just inches above their heads. The air beneath the poncho is thick with the smell of wet wool, old sweat, and the damp earth. One of the boys reaches into his pocket with trembling, stiff fingers. He pulls out a tiny, precious heat tab. He places it carefully on a flat stone, sheltering it from the damp air with his own body. His friend leans in close, blocking the draft. A match is struck. There is a brief, sharp hiss, the sharp smell of sulfur, and then a tiny, wavering blue flame dances to life in the gloom. It is the only light in their world. They place a battered metal canteen cup over the fire, filled with water scooped from the rain. And then, they wait. They watch that tiny flame as if it holds the secret to the universe. They do not speak. The anticipation is a physical presence in the small space between them. Slowly, agonizingly, small bubbles begin to form at the bottom of the tin. A faint wisp of steam rises into the cold air. It will never reach a boil. The rain and the wind will not allow it. But it is warm. The soldier carefully shakes a small packet of instant coffee powder into the lukewarm water. The smell rises instantly, earthy, bitter, and overwhelmingly comforting. He wraps his freezing hands around the metal cup, feeling the gentle heat seep slowly into his numb palms. He holds it there for just a moment, a quiet prayer of gratitude for this fleeting warmth. He takes a small sip. It is barely warm, gritty, and tastes faintly of the metal cup in the muddy river water. But to him, it is the greatest thing he has ever tasted. He lowers the cup, catching the eye of his friend in the dim, blue light of the dying heat tab. He doesn't say a word. He simply passes the cup. His friend takes it, his own hands shaking as they wrap around the warm tin. He takes a slow sip, closes his eyes, and lets out a long, quiet sigh. In that shared cup of lukewarm, muddy coffee, there is a communion more profound than any grand ceremony. It is the unspoken promise that whatever meager comfort one finds, it belongs equally to the other. They are sharing their warmth, sharing their energy, sharing their very will to survive the night. When the darkness fully claimed the fields, turning the world outside the poncho into an impenetrable wall of black, the whispers would begin. It was too cold to sleep, and too quiet to stay silent. The mind, if left alone in the dark, would wander to terrifying places. So, they anchored each other with stories. They spoke in the softest, gentlest tones, their voices blending seamlessly with the sound of the rain. They didn't talk about the war. They talked about heat. A boy from the city would describe, in beautiful, agonizing detail, the way the steam radiator in his apartment would hiss and clank on a snowy Sunday morning, filling the small room with a heavy, sleep-inducing warmth. A boy from the south would talk about the thick, suffocating heat of an August afternoon, the way the air shimmered over the asphalt, and the feeling of sitting on a wooden porch with a glass of iced tea, the condensation dripping down the glass. They painted pictures of fireplaces, of thick woolen blankets piled high on childhood beds, of the blast of hot air from a bakery door swinging open on a winter street. By simply speaking these memories into the cold night, they conjured a psychological fire. They warmed each other with words, wrapping their minds in the comforting embrace of a world that was dry, and safe, and far away. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before the dawn, the exhaustion would finally overpower the cold. A soldier would feel his head dropping forward, his chin resting against the damp wool of his jacket. Sleep in the foxholes was not a peaceful rest, it was a desperate, shivering surrender. But even in sleep, they took care of one another. The boy who was still awake would carefully shift his own freezing body, moving closer to his sleeping friend. He would pull the edges of the leaking poncho tighter around them both, pressing his shoulder firmly against his brother's. He would share his own fading body heat, absorbing the cold so his friend might rest just a little longer. He would listen to the ragged, uneven breathing of the sleeping boy, acting as a silent, fiercely loving guardian in the dark. If you looked closely through the rain, you might see a figure moving slowly, carefully, down the line of waterlogged holes. It is the medic. He carries no weapon, only a canvas bag of bandages and a heart heavy with the care of 100 boys. He slips through the mud, a gentle, unseen phantom. He stops at a hole, kneeling in the puddles. He reaches out and rests a bare hand on a sleeping shoulder. He just wants to feel the rise and fall of the chest. He just wants to make sure the cold hasn't taken too deep a hold. He leaves a piece of dry hardtack under a helmet, a tiny, silent gift, and moves on, an angel of mercy walking through the endless gray. In the quietest part of the night, when the rain soaked through to the skin and the shivering became a deep, uncontrollable tremor in the chest, the mind would inevitably turn to the letters. Tucked away in the deepest, driest pockets, wrapped in scavenged wax paper or a precious waterproof bag, were the lifelines. A young man, unable to stop his teeth from chattering, would slide his hand beneath his jacket, resting his fingers against the crinkling paper over his heart. He wouldn't risk taking the letter out in the rain. The ink would run, the paper would dissolve, and the precious connection would be lost. But he didn't need to read it. He knew the words by heart. He could feel the shape of the letters his mother had written, the loops and slants of a sweetheart's name. He closed his eyes and let the memory of the letter wash over him. He imagined the clean, dry hands that had folded the paper. He imagined the warm yellow light of the lamp on the desk where it was written. He held onto that image with a desperate, crushing grip. It was a tether, an invisible silver thread reaching across the dark ocean, pulling him back from the edge of despair. He would not let the cold win, because he had to return the love folded inside his pocket. The cold embrace of the riverlands tested the men in ways the bullets and the jumping never could. It was a slow, creeping enemy that tried to freeze their spirits and wash away their hope. But as the long, dark night stretched on, the rain only served to wash away the last remaining barriers between them. They were no longer individuals enduring a storm. They were a single, living organism, breathing together, shivering together, and surviving together. The mud that coated their uniforms and stained their faces became a badge of their shared suffering. The cold that seeped into their bones was countered by the deep, unshakable warmth of absolute brotherhood. When the sky finally began to lighten, turning from a heavy black to a soft, watery gray, the rain would often still be falling. The new day did not bring relief from the dampness or the chill. But as the men slowly lifted their heads, peeling their tired eyes open to look at the world, they saw something far more beautiful than the sun. They saw each other. They saw the boy from Kansas, his face pale and smeared with mud, offering a slow, tired smile. They saw the boy from Brooklyn, his helmet pulled low, nodding a quiet, sleepy good morning. They had made it through another night. The river had tried to pull them under, the rain had tried to wash them away, but they had held on. They sat up in the mud, stretched their aching, freezing limbs, and prepared to face the day. They were tired. They were so incredibly cold. But as long as the man beside them was still breathing, as long as they could share a thin poncho and a memory of a warm fire, they knew they would not break. The rain continued its gentle, endless song against the canvas. But beneath it, stronger and more enduring than the storm, was the quiet, beating heart of easy company, resting in the mud, wrapped in the warmth of each other's unwavering love. There is a silence that belongs only to the deep winter woods, a heavy, white quiet that swallows the world whole. It was a sudden, jarring departure that brought them to this frozen place. There had been no time to prepare, no time to gather the heavy winter coats or the thick wool mittens that belonged in a landscape of snow. They were simply loaded into the backs of open canvas trucks, leaving the relative comfort of their quiet encampment behind, and driven straight into the teeth of a bitter, blinding chill. If you were sitting in the back of one of those bouncing, shivering trucks, you would have felt the wind biting through your thin canvas jacket as if it were made of paper. The boys sat shoulder to shoulder on the hard wooden benches, their knees pressed tightly together, their heads bowed against the rushing, icy air. They did not speak. The cold was already stealing their breath. Instead, they communicated in small, desperate gestures of comfort. A hand reaching out to pull a friend's collar up a little higher. A shared match, struck inside a cupped palm, the tiny, momentary flare of orange light illuminating pale, frightened faces before the wind snatched it away. As the trucks finally rolled to a halt and the engines died away, the men stepped down into a world that looked like a terrifying, beautiful fairy tale. They had entered the ancient, towering pine forests. The trees stretched up impossibly high, their dark, heavy branches bowing under the weight of freshly fallen snow. The ground was an unbroken ocean of brilliant white. When they took their first steps, the snow crunched sharply beneath their leather boots, a sound that seemed to echo for miles in the profound, waiting stillness of the woods. The air here did not just feel cold, it felt sharp, tasting of frozen pine needles and ancient, sleeping earth. They were told to hold the line right there, beneath the shadows of the giant trees. And so, the young men looked down at the snow, took out their small, folding shovels, and prepared to dig. But the earth in the winter woods does not yield to those who ask. Beneath the soft, deceptive layer of powder, the ground was frozen solid. It was as hard as iron. Listen to the rhythmic, heartbreaking sound of a shovel striking the frozen topsoil. Clink, clink, clink. It was a painfully slow, exhausting process. The metal blades bounced off the dirt, sending painful vibrations up the wooden handles and into the boys' freezing, aching hands. They chipped away at the ice, breathing heavily, their breath pluming in the frigid air like gray smoke. They used their hands to clear the frozen chunks, their fingernails cracking, their bare skin burning against the frost. It was a desperate kind of labor. The exertion brought a temporary, sweating warmth to their bodies, but as soon as they stopped to rest, that sweat turned instantly to a layer of ice against their skin. They could not dig deep. They could only manage to carve out shallow, miserable bowls in the frozen floor of the forest, just deep enough to hide a boy's trembling frame. To make these shallow graves livable, they became gentle, desperate scavengers. They walked softly through the snow, using their bayonets to quietly saw off the lower branches of the pine trees. They carried these fragrant green boughs back to their holes, laying them down over the ice in a soft, thick layer. It was a beautiful, tender act of homemaking in the most brutal of environments. They were building nests in the snow, trying to weave a tiny barrier between their fragile bodies and the unforgiving earth. When the digging was finally done, and the sun began its early, pale descent behind the trees, the true test of the winter woods began. Without winter coats, without thick blankets, the cold became a living, breathing adversary. It crept through the seams of their boots, it numbed their toes until they could no longer feel them, and it settled deep inside their chests with a heavy, aching weight. They resorted to anything they could find to trap the warmth. They wrapped empty burlap supply sacks around their freezing feet, tying them tight with scraps of wire. They stuffed crumpled newspaper inside their thin jackets. But the only true defense they had against the freezing dark was each other. In the dim, blue light of the falling dusk, picture two boys slowly lowering themselves into their shallow pine-lined nest. They do not sit apart. There is no room for pride or personal space in the freezing woods. They sit back to back, pressing the lengths of their spines together, feeling the subtle, vibrating shivers of the man behind them. They pull a single, thin olive-drab blanket over their heads, creating a tiny, dark tent against the falling snow. Beneath that blanket, a profound and quiet intimacy unfolds. They rub each other's arms, their stiff, clumsy hands trying to generate friction through the rough wool. If one boy's hands are completely numb, a terrifying pale white, his friend will gently take them, open his own jacket, and place those freezing hands directly against his own warm stomach, sharing his core heat without a second thought. It is an act of absolute, unconditional love. Take my warmth. Take what little I have left, just please, stay with me. As the night fully claims the forest, the temperature plummets even further. The moisture in the air crystallizes, glittering like diamond dust in the pale moonlight that filters through the canopy. The silence of the woods is absolute, broken only by the occasional, sharp crack of a tree branch snapping under the extreme cold, a sound that echoes like a gunshot in the still air. To keep the creeping dread of the cold at bay, the whispers begin again. They huddle under the blanket, their lips practically touching the ears of their brothers, their breath mingling in the tiny, shared space. They talk about fireplaces. A boy from a farm in Ohio describes the big, cast-iron wood stove in his mother's kitchen, the way the oak logs would pop and hiss, throwing a deep, radiant orange glow across the linoleum floor. He describes the way the family dog would sleep so close to the metal that his fur would be almost too hot to touch. The boy listening closes his eyes, focusing entirely on the words. He imagines he is there, sitting on that kitchen floor, stretching his freezing toes toward the phantom fire. The whispered stories are their only fuel. They are burning memories to keep their souls from freezing over. Sometimes, a soldier will slowly pull a folded piece of paper from deep inside his shirt, holding it close to his chest where it has absorbed his own body heat. In the faint, glowing reflection of the moonlight on the snow, he stares at the familiar handwriting of a letter from home. He reads about a sister complaining that the house is too stuffy because their father left the furnace running high all night. He reads about a sweetheart buying a new, soft wool sweater. The contrast between the words on the page and the biting, icy reality of the forest is almost too much to bear. But he traces the ink with a trembling finger, drawing strength from the knowledge that somewhere in the world, warmth still exists. Somewhere, people are safe, and dry, and walking through rooms filled with golden light. He folds the letter away, tucking it back over his heart, a fragile shield of paper defending him against the endless white. In the deepest, darkest hours of the night, when the exhaustion finally overtakes the shivering, they must try to sleep. But sleep in the frozen woods is a dangerous, terrifying thing. It is a heavy, seductive pull that promises an end to the pain, an end to the cold. So, they make a quiet, sacred pact. One boy will sleep, while the other stays awake to watch the tree line, but more importantly, to watch his brother. The boy on watch sits perfectly still, his rifle resting across his knees, the metal so cold it burns through his thin gloves. He watches the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of the blanket covering his sleeping friend. Every few minutes, he reaches out. He gently touches the sleeping boy's shoulder, giving it a soft, reassuring squeeze. He listens closely to the breathing. If the breath becomes too shallow, or the shivering completely stops, he will gently shake his friend awake, whispering his name into the cold air, pulling him back from the edge of the deep, freezing sleep. He acts as a guardian angel in the snow, sacrificing his own rest, fighting his own heavy eyelids, simply because the life of the boy beside him is more precious to him than his own comfort. As the long, agonizing hours stretch on, the moonlight slowly fades, giving way to the pale, bruised purple of the approaching dawn. The night in the white woods is finally ending. The boy on watch takes a slow, deep breath of the sharp, pine-scented air. He looks around at the neighboring foxholes, seeing the small, snow-covered mounds where the rest of his brothers are slowly beginning to stir. They look like statues carved from ice, slowly coming back to life. He turns and gently nudges the boy sleeping beside him. The friend blinks his eyes open, his eyelashes heavy with frost. He looks up at the watcher, a silent, weary question in his eyes. The watcher just nods, a small, stiff smile cracking the dirt and ice on his face. They have survived the night. They are still freezing, they are still hungry, and the endless expanse of the winter woods still surrounds them. But as they sit up, brushing the freshly fallen snow from their shoulders. They feel the solid, comforting presence of each other. The cold has tried to break them, tried to isolate them in their own individual suffering. But the frozen earth and the biting wind have only driven them closer together. They stand up in the snow, stomping their numb feet, their breath rising together in a shared, defiant cloud against the morning sky. The winter is long, and the woods are deep, but they walk into the new day exactly as they survived the night, side by side, anchored by the quiet, unyielding warmth of a love that the frost can never touch. There is a softness to the way snow settles on a cold rifle, a gentle, white lace that tries to hide the hardness of the steel. If you were to lie very still in the Ardennes forest during those midwinter nights, the world would feel as though it had been wrapped in thick, velvet cotton. The snow did not just fall, it descended with a deliberate, rhythmic grace, layering itself over the pine needles, the frozen mud, and the shoulders of the men who sat waiting in the earth. The forest had a way of swallowing sound. A snapping twig 100 yards away sounded like a muffled secret, and the heavy, synchronized breathing of the company was the only clock that mattered. Everything was white, silver, and a deep, bruised blue. Imagine the quietest room you have ever known, then add the scent of frozen sap and the biting, clean taste of the winter air. This was the cathedral of the woods. The young men of Easy Company had become part of this landscape, their faces pale and etched with the delicate lines of exhaustion, their bodies curled into small, shivering shapes within their foxholes. They were no longer just soldiers, they were watchers of the mist, keepers of the winter's hush. Look at a young man sitting in his shallow home beneath a towering fir. His fingers, stiff and waxy from the chill, are tucked deep into his armpits to catch a fleeting spark of his own body's warmth. He watches a single snowflake land on the barrel of his rifle. It sits there for a heartbeat, a perfect, crystalline star, before the lingering heat of a recent clinging turns it into a tiny, clear bead of water. He finds himself mesmerized by that small transformation. In a world of immense, terrifying forces, he anchors his mind to that one drop of water. It is a tiny, manageable miracle. He thinks of his father's workshop back in Pennsylvania. He remembers the smell of sawdust and the way the orange sparks would fly from the grindstone when his father sharpened an old axe. He can almost feel the radiant heat from the wood stove in the corner of that shop, a heat so intense it made your skin tingle. He closes his eyes and tries to pull that memory over himself like a heavy wool blanket. He isn't thinking of the maps or the orders. He is thinking of the way his mother used to leave a glass of warm milk on the nightstand when he had a fever as a child. He is holding onto his humanity with the desperate, quiet grip of a dreamer. The silence of the woods was not empty. It was filled with the internal voices of 100 men, all whispering the names of people they loved into the cold. But then, the muffled peace of the forest began to dissolve. It did not happen with a scream or a sudden flash. It began as a low, heavy thudding in the distance, a vibration that traveled through the frozen roots of the trees and up into the soles of their boots. It was the sound of the world cracking open. The noise arrived like a sudden, violent wind that tore through the beautiful white lace of the trees. It was a rhythmic, hollow pounding that shattered the silver stillness, turning the peaceful snow into a chaotic fountain of dark earth and splintered wood. In those moments, the world felt as though it were being unmade. The tall, ancient pines that had provided shelter and shade were suddenly broken, their heavy branches falling like wounded giants. The air was no longer clean and cold, it was thick with the scent of burnt sulfur and the heavy, bitter dust of the disturbed earth. Yet, even as the noise grew, the story remained a human one. In the middle of the chaos, there was a different kind of movement. It was not the frantic rush of a battle, but the steady, purposeful crawl of the medic. Picture him moving through the white and gray blur of the woods. He does not carry a rifle. His hands are not occupied with the tools of the noise. Instead, his pockets are filled with small, fragile vials of sleep and rolls of white cotton that look like the snow itself. He moves from one foxhole to another, a shadow of mercy in a world of steel. When he reaches a fallen brother, the first thing he offers is not a bandage, but a touch. He reaches out with his bare hand, despite the biting frost, and rests it against the boy's cheek. His skin is warm, a startling, life-giving contrast to the freezing winter. He leans in close, his voice a soft, steady anchor in the storm. "I'm here," he whispers. "You're okay. I've got you." These are the smallest words, but in the Ardennes, they were the most powerful things ever spoken. The medic works with a quiet, practiced grace, his fingers moving like a gardener's, tending to the broken things in the winter. He doesn't look at the sky or the falling trees. He looks only into the eyes of the boy before him. He creates a tiny, private world of two, a sanctuary where the only things that exist are his gentle hands and the promise of another breath. He pulls a small, crumpled piece of chocolate from his kit, a secret he had been saving, and presses a tiny corner of it against the boy's lips. It is a small sweetness in a bitter place, a gesture of profound kindness that carries more weight than any medal. He stays until the shivering slows, until the boy's eyes find their focus again, and then he crawls back into the mist to find the next soul who needs to be reminded that they are not alone. As the heavy thudding eventually fades, leaving the forest in a new, ringing kind of silence, the brotherhood of the company reveals itself in the whispers that travel down the line. The noise has passed, but the fear remains, cold and sharp. In the aftermath, two friends who share a foxhole turn toward each other. Their faces are smeared with the dark soot of the forest, their eyes wide and bright. They do not talk about the danger they just survived. They do not talk about the war. Instead, they reach for each other's hands in the dark, a firm, grounding grip that says everything the heart cannot. "We're going home, Joe," one whispers, his voice trembling only a little. "We're going to sit on that porch and drink that cider your sister makes. I'm going to see you through this. You hear me? I'm not going anywhere without you." "I hear you," the other replies, his voice barely a breath. "I'll hold you to it. We'll go to the lake. We'll go fishing in the spring when the ice is gone." These were the whispered promises that kept the blood moving in their veins. They were not grand oaths made in cathedrals, they were the simple, desperate pacts of boys who had seen the world break and decided to mend it with friendship. They promised each other the spring. They promised each other the smell of rain on hot pavement, the sound of a baseball hitting a leather mitt, and the warmth of a kitchen light left on for them. They sat together as the snow began to fall again, a fresh, clean layer of white drifting down to cover the scars of the noise. The snow settled on the splintered trees, it settled on the edges of their foxholes, and it settled once more on the cold steel of their rifles. The medic sat in his own small hole, his hands finally tucked away, his head resting against the frozen dirt. He closed his eyes and listened to the whispers of his brothers. He heard the promises of fishing trips and Sunday dinners. He heard the quiet resilience of 100 hearts beating in unison against the winter. Everywhere in the woods, there were small moments of heroism that no one would ever see. There was the boy who gave his last dry pair of socks to a friend whose feet had turned the color of the ice. There was the sergeant who walked the line in the middle of the night, not to check their gear, but to quietly tuck a blanket closer around a sleeping soldier's neck. There was the sharing of a single, cold biscuit, broken into 3 pieces so everyone could have a taste of something solid. This was the true history of the company. It was not found in the maps of the generals or the technical designations of the units. It was found in the warmth of a hand, the sweetness of a hidden piece of chocolate, and the unwavering belief that as long as they were together, the winter could not truly touch them. The Ardennes was a place of immense cold, but it was also a place of immense warmth. The heat didn't come from fires, which were too dangerous to light, but from the proximity of one soul to another. It was a radiant heat generated by the absolute trust that the man to your left and the man to your right would rather die than let you be alone. As the night deepened and the stars began to peek through the breaking clouds, casting a pale, silver light over the white woods, the company drifted into a collective, shallow sleep. They dreamed of home, their minds traveling far away from the frozen forest to places where the snow was something beautiful you watched from a window while sitting by a fire. Listen to the forest now. The noise is a memory. The trees are still. The only sound is the soft, rhythmic patter of the snow falling on the steel helmets, a gentle, metallic lullaby for the boys who had become men in the dark. They are resting now, anchored by their promises, held by the gentle memory of the medic's touch, and waiting for the morning together. They are cold, they are tired, and they are miles from everything they know. But in the white silence of the woods, they are the warmest thing in the world, for they are brothers, and they have seen each other through the night. The world ends where the trees do, giving way to a white emptiness that feels as wide as the ocean. For weeks, the young men of Easy Company had lived within the dark, protective embrace of the Ardennes forest. They had grown accustomed to the vertical lines of the pines, the way the branches caught the snow before it could reach their faces, and the deep, indigo shadows that offered a fragile sense of sanctuary. The woods were cold, yes, and they were dangerous, but they were also a home. Within the trees, the world was measured in inches and feet, and the distance between one foxhole and the next. But now, they had come to the edge. If you were to stand there with them, tucked just behind the last row of ancient, frost-covered firs, you would see it. The forest suddenly stops, as if a great hand had swept the trees away, leaving only a vast, rolling field of untouched snow. It is a beautiful, terrifying expanse. Under the pale, thin light of a winter morning, the clearing glows with a brilliant, blinding whiteness. It looks like a pristine sheet of paper, waiting for a story to be written upon it. But the men know that to step out onto that paper is to become a dark ink blot against the white. To move out there is to be seen. To be seen is to be vulnerable. The air at the edge of the clearing is different. It is sharper, unshielded by the boughs, carrying the biting scent of the open sky. The silence here is not the muffled quiet of the deep woods, it is a high, thin silence that rings in the ears. It is the sound of 1,000 held breaths. Look at the young soldier leaning his shoulder against a frozen trunk. His breath rises in a slow, steady plume of white, drifting upward like a silent prayer. He is perfectly still, yet inside, his heart is a bird trapped in a cage, fluttering against his ribs with a frantic, desperate rhythm. He looks out at the clearing and his mind begins to play a strange, slow-motion game. He counts the steps it would take to reach the other side. 1, 2, 3. He imagines the way his boots will sink into the deep, powdery crust. He imagines the sound of the snow crunching, a sound that, in his mind, is as loud as a thunderclap. The anxiety of the weight is a heavy, physical thing. It settles in the pit of the stomach like a cold stone. It makes the fingers feel thick and clumsy. It makes the eyes ache from staring so hard at the distant, hazy line of trees on the far side of the field, a goal that looks 1,000,000 miles away. In this moment of paralyzing stillness, the boy feels a gentle pressure against his arm. He doesn't need to turn his head to know who it is. It is his friend, the boy from the farm in Illinois who shared a half-frozen bar of chocolate with him last night. The friend doesn't say a word. He simply stands there, his shoulder touching the boy's, a solid and unmoving anchor in the rising tide of fear. There is a profound, quiet heroism in that touch. It is a message passed through the heavy wool of their sleeves. I am here. Whatever the clearing holds, I am going into it with you. You are not alone on the ice. The boy reaches into his pocket. His hand finds a small, smooth stone he picked up in England months and lifetimes ago. He turns it over in his palm, feeling its familiar shape, grounding himself in the simple reality of its weight. He thinks of the letters he has tucked away near his heart. He thinks of the way his sister's laughter sounded on a summer afternoon, a bright, golden sound that seems impossible in this world of blue and white. He draws these memories around him like a cloak, a fragile barrier of warmth against the creeping chill of the open field. Then, the signal comes. It isn't a loud shout. It is a soft, rhythmic movement, a ripple traveling down the line of men. One by one, they begin to detach themselves from the shadows of the trees. Step with them as they cross that invisible line. The moment your boot leaves the shelter of the forest and sinks into the open snow, the world changes. You feel suddenly, impossibly large. Every movement feels exaggerated, every rustle of canvas sounds like a shout. You are a shadow walking across a mirror. But as they move, a strange, surreal calm begins to descend. The paralyzing anxiety of the weight is replaced by the simple, repetitive task of the journey. One foot in front of the other. The lift of the knee. The push against the deep, clinging powder. The world shrinks down to the small circle of snow immediately in front of your toes. They move in a long, staggered line, a chain of human spirits stretched across the white void. The wind whistles over the open ground, tugging at their jackets, trying to steal the heat from their skin. But the heat stays. It stays because of the man in front of you, whose footprints you are stepping into, making your own path a little easier. It stays because of the man behind you, whose presence you can feel like a warm light at your back. The clearing is a place of absolute honesty. There is nowhere to hide your fear, nowhere to pretend you are anything other than a young man a long way from home. And yet, in that vulnerability, there is a magnificent strength. They are walking together. They are a single pulse, a single collective will moving toward the distant shadows of the far trees. Midway across the field, the silence is broken. It isn't the loud noise of the woods. It is a sharp, whistling sound, a sound like a hot wire being whipped through the air. The snow around them begins to kick up in small, silent puffs, as if invisible raindrops were falling from a clear sky. In that moment, the dreamlike calm shatters. The instinct is to freeze, to disappear, to sink into the white and become part of the ice. But they don't stop. They cannot stop. Think of the quiet resilience of the boy in the middle of the line. He feels the air snap past his ear. He feels the sudden, sharp spike of terror that threatens to lock his joints. But then he looks at the sergeant just ahead of him. The sergeant is moving with a steady, purposeful gait, his head down, his shoulders squared against the wind. He looks like a man walking through a heavy rainstorm on his way to work. That image of ordinary, everyday steadiness is a lifeline. The boy takes a breath, a cold, sharp lungful of winter air, and he keeps moving. He doesn't run in a blind panic. He moves with a quiet, stubborn dignity. He refuses to let the clearing take his spirit. He focuses on the rhythm of his own breathing. In, out. In, out. Each breath is a small victory. Each step is a defiant claim on his own life. The far tree line slowly begins to grow. The hazy, blue shapes resolve into the familiar textures of bark and pine needles. The shadows reach out toward them like long, dark fingers, offering to pull them back into the safety of the gloom. The final few yards are the longest. The snow seems deeper here, the wind colder, the whistles in the air more frequent. The boys are gasping now, their lungs burning, their legs heavy as stone. But they are so close. They can see the frost on the lower branches. They can smell the sweet, resinous scent of the pines. And then, they are through. One by one, they stumble into the deep shadows of the new woods. They don't celebrate. They don't cheer. They simply collapse. They fall into the snow beneath the protective canopy of the trees, their bodies shaking with a violent, uncontrollable release of tension. Imagine the profound, silent relief of that moment. You are lying on your back, staring up through the dark lace of the branches at the pale sky. Your heart is still hammering, your breath is ragged and loud in the sudden stillness of the forest. But you are alive. You have crossed the white void and you are still here. The boy from the farm in Illinois crawls over to his friend. He is gasping for air, his face pale and smeared with the soot of the woods. He reaches out and grabs the boy's hand, squeezing it with a strength that says more than 1,000 speeches ever could. They look at each other, their eyes bright with the shared knowledge of what they have just survived. They have looked into the white emptiness and they have come back. A few feet away, a medic is moving among the resting men. He isn't checking for wounds this time, he is checking for the light in their eyes. He offers a canteen of water. It is nearly frozen, filled with slushy ice, but to the boy who takes a sip, it is the sweetest, most life-giving thing he has ever tasted. He shares the water with his friend, the metal cup passing between them like a sacred chalice. The morning sun rises a little higher, its light filtering through the trees in soft, golden shafts. It illuminates the steam rising from their wet uniforms. It catches the frost on their eyelashes. The forest is quiet again, a cathedral of silver and green. As they sit there, leaning against the ancient trunks, a sense of peace begins to settle over the company. It is a fragile peace, earned at a terrible cost, but it is deep and real. They realize, with a quiet, shimmering clarity, the incredible value of a single, ordinary breath. They realize that to survive a morning like this is a miracle of the highest order. They look back at the clearing they just crossed. From the safety of the shadows, it looks beautiful again. Their footprints are a long, wandering line of dark blue stitches across the white fabric of the field. The wind is already beginning to blow the snow into the hollows of those prints, slowly erasing the evidence of their journey. But the memory will never be erased. They carry the clearing within them now. They carry the knowledge of the fear, and the even greater knowledge of the love that saw them through it. They know that they can be terrified and still move forward. They know that they can be vulnerable and still be strong. The young soldier pulls the small, smooth stone from his pocket one last time. He looks at it, then leans over and tucks it into the snow at the base of the tree, a quiet marker of the place where he found his life again. He stands up, brushing the frost from his knees. He feels a new kind of strength in his legs, not the strength of muscles, but the quiet, unyielding strength of a survivor. The march will continue soon. There are more woods to navigate, more hills to climb, more nights to endure in the cold earth. But for now, in the golden light of this improbable morning, they simply stand together in the shadows. They breathe the sharp, clean air. They look at the faces of their brothers. And in the profound, healing silence of the forest, they prepare themselves for the next edge, the next clearing, and the next sunrise, knowing that as long as they have each other, they will always find their way back to the trees. The river was a silver ribbon of silence that separated two worlds, both of them tired of the dark. After the bone-chilling cruelty of the white woods, the world had begun to thaw, but it was a slow and melancholy awakening. The men of the company found themselves in a quiet town, a place of stone and shadows perched on the edge of a narrow, rushing river. The snow was no longer a pristine blanket, it had turned into a heavy, weeping slush that clung to the cobblestones and filled the gutters with a constant, rhythmic dripping. It was as if the earth itself were finally letting out a long-held breath, crying softly as the ice began to break. If you were to walk down those narrow streets in the blue light of a late winter afternoon, you would feel a strange, haunting stillness. The houses, once filled with the warmth of families and the smell of baking bread, stood hollow and watchful. Their windows were like dark, empty eyes, staring across the water at the other side of the town, where another army sat in the same gray silence. There was no grand movement here, no thunderous noise. There was only the river, wide and cold, flowing between the two banks like a boundary between ghosts. The men moved into the cellars. They became creatures of the underground, seeking the damp, earthy safety of stone floors and low ceilings. In these quiet, subterranean spaces, the exhaustion of the last few months finally caught up with them. It was a fatigue that went deeper than the muscles. It was a weariness of the spirit, a heavy, velvet cloak that settled over their shoulders and refused to be shaken off. They were young men, barely in the spring of their lives, yet as they sat in the dim light of a flickering candle, their faces held the weight of ancient statues. Imagine a small cellar, the air smelling of old wine barrels and wet wool. A young soldier sits in the corner, his back against the cold stone wall. He has a small, stubby pencil in his hand and a crumpled sheet of paper on his knee. He is trying to write a letter home to a girl in a sunny town in California. He starts to write about the weather, but the words feel heavy and useless. How does he tell her about the river? How does he explain the way the mist crawls across the water at night, turning the world into a dream where nothing is real? He looks at his hands, stained with the soot of the woods and the grease of his rifle, and he feels like a stranger to the boy who used to take her to the movies. He writes instead about a small cat he found in the ruins. He tells her how the tiny, shivering thing curled up in his lap while he ate his cold rations, its purr a small, vibrating miracle in the middle of a world that had forgotten how to be soft. He writes about the way the light catches the ripples of the river at dawn. He protects her with his silence, folding his melancholy into the paper and sealing it away, keeping the gray shadows of the river for himself. Outside, on the riverbank, the standoff continued. It was a strange and eerie dance of shadows. Because the water was so narrow, the men could hear the world on the other side. In the deep, velvet quiet of the night, they could hear the muffled cough of a sentry across the way. They could hear the faint, metallic clink of a mess tin or the low murmur of voices speaking a language they didn't understand, but whose tone they knew by heart. It was a tone of longing, of cold, and of a desperate desire for the sun to rise. There was a silent, unwritten agreement in those long days. Neither side wanted to break the stillness. It was as if both armies were too tired to carry the weight of the noise anymore. They watched each other through the mist, tiny figures moving behind lace curtains or ducking into doorways, and for a fleeting moment, the labels of enemy felt thin and fragile. They were all just cold, tired men, divided by a ribbon of water and a world gone wrong. One night, the mist was so thick it felt like walking through a cloud. A young soldier was standing guard at a window overlooking the river. He was wrapped in a captured civilian blanket, a colorful, knitted thing that felt absurdly out of place against his olive-drab uniform. As he stared out at the gray void, he heard a sound drifting across the water. It wasn't the sound of a rifle or a boot. It was the sound of a harmonica. The music was thin and haunting, a slow, mournful melody that seemed to float on the surface of the river. It was a song of home, not his home, but the idea of home. It spoke of warm rooms, of mothers calling children in for dinner, of a life where the only thing that mattered was the turning of the seasons. The soldier closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cold glass. For a few minutes, the war vanished. There were no cellars, no rivers, no shadows. There was only the music, a bridge of sound built out of the same loneliness that lived in his own chest. When the song ended, the silence that followed was even deeper than before. The soldier didn't shoot. He didn't call out. He just stood there in the dark, feeling a strange, quiet kinship with the person on the other side. They were both trapped in the same gray dream, waiting for the world to wake up. Small acts of kindness became the currency of survival in the town. In one cellar, a group of men found a stash of preserved fruit, hidden behind a false wall by a family long since fled. The jars were dusty and cold, but the peaches inside were like small, trapped pieces of summer. They didn't gobble them down in a frenzy. Instead, they sat in a circle, passing a single spoon, each man taking one slice of the golden fruit and savoring it with a quiet, reverent intensity. They spoke in whispers, the sweetness of the peaches a sharp, beautiful contrast to the bitter taste of the winter. They shared stories of their favorite desserts back home, apple pies cooling on windowsills, ice cream sodas at the corner drugstore. In that damp basement, they weren't soldiers holding a line, they were boys at a Sunday picnic, clinging to the memory of a world that was sweet and kind. The melancholy of the Riverlands was a slow-acting medicine. It stripped away the last of their bravado, leaving behind a raw, honest resilience. They learned to find peace in the smallest things, the way the steam rose from a cup of coffee, the dry socks they shared when a supply truck finally made it through the mud, the steady, rhythmic breathing of a friend sleeping on a pile of rags in the corner. They became experts in the art of waiting. There is a specific courage in waiting. It is the courage to sit with your own thoughts when the world is quiet and the future is a gray mist. It is the resilience to stay kind when you are hollowed out by exhaustion. One afternoon, a soldier noticed an old woman who had remained in her house near the river, despite the danger. She was trying to clear the heavy, wet slush from her front step with a broken broom. She moved with a painful slowness, her breath coming in short, ragged puffs. The soldier watched her for a moment from his position behind a stone wall. He knew he shouldn't move, that the other side was watching. But the sight of her struggle was more than he could bear. He laid his rifle down and stepped out into the open. He walked across the street, his boots splashing in the puddles. He didn't look at the other side of the river. He didn't think about the shadows. He simply walked up to the woman, took the broom from her trembling hands, and began to clear the steps. He worked quickly and quietly, his movements steady and strong. When he was finished, he handed the broom back to her. The woman looked up at him, her eyes clouded with age and tears. She reached out and touched his sleeve, her fingers lingering for a second on the rough fabric. She didn't say thank you, she didn't have to. The look of profound, simple recognition in her eyes was enough. He was a human being again, if only for 5 minutes. He stepped back across the street and returned to his shadows, feeling a strange, new warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. As the days bled into weeks, the ice on the river began to break apart in earnest. Great white slabs of frozen water drifted downstream, bumping into each other with a soft, hollow sound. The water grew louder, more insistent, a rushing symphony of change. The air began to lose its sharp, metallic bite, replaced by the earthy scent of the coming spring. But the men were still tired. The winter had taken something from them that the sun could not immediately replace. They sat in their cellars and watched the river, feeling the shadows shift and change. They knew the standoff would not last forever. They knew the quiet would eventually be broken, and the march would begin again. Yet, as they prepared to leave the town of stone and water, they carried the river with them. They carried the memory of the harmonica in the mist, the taste of the preserved peaches, and the touch of an old woman's hand. They had learned that even in the most eerie of standoffs, even when divided by a boundary of cold water, the human spirit remains a stubborn, flickering light. On their final night, the moon came out, casting a pale, silver glow over the town. The river looked like a road made of light, flowing toward a horizon they couldn't see. The men gathered their gear, moving with the quiet efficiency of those who had lived in the dark for a long time. They looked back at the cellars that had been their homes, at the windows that had been their eyes, and at the river that had been their mirror. They were moving forward, but they were not the same. They were older, quieter, and deeply entwined. The shadows across the river had taught them that the enemy was often just as tired as they were, and that the only true victory was holding onto the soft, vulnerable parts of themselves in a world that tried to turn them to stone. As the column of men slowly wound its way out of the town and away from the water, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic splash of their boots in the melting slush. The river continued to flow, indifferent to the armies on its banks, carrying the winter away to the sea. And in the heart of the company, a quiet, shared melancholy settled into a new kind of strength, a strength that didn't need to shout, a resilience that was as steady and as deep as the river itself. They walked into the night, ready for the spring, ready for the end, and forever changed by the shadows they had left behind. The first flower to push through the blackened soil did not know it was growing in the ruins of an empire. If you were to sit very still by the side of a country road in Germany during those middle weeks of spring, you would hear the world beginning to wake up from a very long and very dark sleep. The air, which for so many months had tasted of frozen iron and wood smoke, was suddenly changing. It carried the scent of damp moss, of pine sap warming in the sun, and the delicate, honeyed sweetness of cherry blossoms floating on a gentle breeze. The rivers, once choked with jagged cakes of ice, were now rushing silver ribbons, singing a song of movement and release as they tumbled toward the sea. For the young men of easy company, this change in the weather was a surreal and breathtaking gift. They had lived for so long in a world of gray and white, a world where the only colors were the dark olive of their uniforms and the crimson of their struggles. Now, as they marched deeper into the heart of a crumbling country, the landscape began to bleed into vibrant, impossible greens. They saw rolling hillsides covered in emerald grass and ancient forests that looked like something out of a childhood storybook. But it was a strange kind of beauty. It was a beauty haunted by the heavy ashes of a world that was falling apart. As they walked through the quiet villages, they didn't see the grand displays of power they had been told to expect. Instead, they saw white bedsheets hanging limply from upstairs windows, makeshift flags of surrender that fluttered in the spring wind like the wings of tired birds. They saw old men sitting on stone benches with their heads in their hands, and children with wide, hollow eyes who watched the column of soldiers pass with a mixture of fear and wonder. The regime that had cast such a long and terrifying shadow over the world was dissolving into dust beneath their boots, leaving behind only the quiet, desperate reality of human beings trying to survive the wreckage. Imagine a young soldier, his uniform worn thin and his boots caked with the red dust of the road. He feels the sun on the back of his neck, a warmth so long forgotten that it feels like a miracle. He hitches his pack higher on his shoulders, but the weight feels different today. The heavy, grinding pressure of the winter has begun to lift, replaced by a light, fluttering sensation in his chest. It is a feeling he is almost afraid to name. It is the realization that the end might actually be near. For years, the future had been a wall of fog. They had lived 1 hour at a time, one foxhole at a time, never daring to look too far ahead for fear of what they might not see. But now, in the golden light of April, the fog was beginning to thin. They found themselves talking about things they hadn't mentioned since the mountain in Georgia. They talked about the taste of fresh milk. They talked about the feeling of clean sheets. They talked about the specific, beautiful boredom of a Sunday afternoon on a front porch. In the quiet evenings, when the company halted in some nameless meadow or the outskirts of a silent town, a profound stillness would settle over the men. They didn't gather in boisterous groups anymore. Instead, they sought out small, private corners of the world. Picture a soldier sitting by a small, clear stream that winds through a pasture. He has taken off his boots and his socks, letting his pale, battered feet rest in the icy water. The sensation is sharp and shocking, but it makes him feel alive in a way he hasn't felt in a lifetime. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small, silver-framed mirror he found in a ruined house. He looks at his reflection, really looks at it, for the first time in months. He sees the lines around his eyes that weren't there when he left home. He sees the way his jaw has hardened. He sees a man who has walked through the white woods and the green mazes. But beneath the dirt and the exhaustion, he sees something else. He sees a flicker of the boy who used to go to dances and work on old cars. He splashes some water on his face, the coldness washing away the lingering soot of the winter, and he smiles a very small, very tired smile. He is still here. The spring has found him, and he is still here. In these moments of quiet reflection, the thoughts of home became almost overwhelming. They weren't just thoughts anymore, they were physical longings. They could almost smell the coffee brewing in their mother's kitchens. They could almost hear the sound of a lawnmower in the distance or the chime of a church bell on a quiet morning. They began to write letters that were different from the ones before. They didn't have to protect their families from the darkness as much anymore. Instead, they filled the pages with the light of the present. A young man sits on an overturned crate, using his knee as a desk. He writes to his wife, his pen moving slowly and carefully over the paper. "The trees are all in bloom here, darling," he writes. "If you didn't look at the broken walls and the burnt-out trucks, you would think this was the most peaceful place on earth. I saw a little girl today picking yellow flowers by the side of the road. She reminded me of our niece. The sun is out, and for the first time in a long time, I think I can see the road home. I'm starting to believe I'm actually going to hold you again." He folds the letter gently, pressing his thumb against the crease. He doesn't mention the smell of the ruins or the strange, heavy silence of the surrendering cities. He only sends her the flowers and the sun. He is weaving a bridge of words, a path of ink that leads away from the ashes and back to the life he left behind. Even in the heart of the crumbling regime, small moments of human kindness bloomed like the wildflowers in the fields. The soldiers, who had every reason to be hard and bitter, found themselves reaching out in ways that surprised them. One afternoon, the column passed an old woman sitting on a pile of rubble that had once been her home. She was trying to boil a small pot of water over a tiny fire of broken lath and plaster. As the sergeant walked by, he saw that she had nothing to put in the water. He didn't think about the technicalities or the politics. He simply stopped, reached into his pack, and pulled out a tin of beef and a handful of crackers. He set them down beside her without saying a word. The woman looked up, her face a map of grief and age. She didn't say thank you, she couldn't. But she reached out and touched the sleeve of his jacket, her fingers trembling against the rough fabric. The sergeant nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared humanity, and then he kept walking. He carried the warmth of that small act with him for miles, a tiny candle of goodness in a world that had seen so much dark. The heroism of these days was a quiet resilience. It was the strength to keep moving through the debris of an empire without losing one's soul. They saw the grand monuments of the regime toppled and broken, the bronze eagles lying in the mud, the symbols of hate being scrubbed away by the rain. They realized that all the noise and the fury of the war was finally giving way to the simple, enduring things, the earth, the sky, and the hearts of the people who remained. But there was a fear, too, a private, whispered fear that haunted the edges of their joy. It was the fear of the final step. Now that the end was so close, the thought of being the last one to fall was an unbearable weight. They became more careful, more watchful. They looked at each other with a new kind of intensity, a silent plea to just stay safe for a little longer. They leaned on each other more than ever. The brotherhood that had been forged in the fire was now the only thing that felt solid in a world of shifting ruins. They shared the last of their tobacco, sitting in the twilight and watching the smoke curl up toward the stars. They told the same stories they had told 1,000 times before, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of each other's voices. They were like travelers who had walked a very long way through a storm, and now that the sky was clearing, they were leaning on each other's shoulders to make it the rest of the way. As they moved toward the mountains, the air grew cooler and crisper, but the sun remained bright. They saw the Bavarian Alps rising in the distance, their peaks covered in a pure, glittering white that looked nothing like the snow of the Ardennes. These were mountains of peace, high and silent, standing above the wreckage of the world. Walking through this landscape, a surreal realization washed over the company. They were no longer just surviving, they were witnessing the rebirth of the world. They were the ones who had seen the winter at its worst, and now they were the ones who would see the spring triumph. The heavy ashes they walked through were being washed away by the gentle spring rains. The scars on the earth were being covered by the rising grass. The silence of the regime was being filled by the return of the birds. On one of those final nights of the march, the company camped in an orchard. The trees were heavy with white blossoms, and the ground was carpeted with petals that looked like a soft, warm snow. The men lay down beneath the branches, the scent of the flowers thick in the air. Listen to the sound of the orchard in the dark. There is no thud of distant noise. There is no whistling in the air. There is only the soft rustle of the leaves and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the men. They are resting in the heart of the enemy's country, but they are not afraid. They are surrounded by beauty, and they are starting to remember how to be at peace. A young soldier lies on his back, staring up through the blossoms at the moon. He feels the soft earth beneath him, no longer frozen, no longer weeping. He feels the steady beat of his own heart, a quiet drum counting down the days. He thinks of the mountain in Georgia, the dark skies over France, and the frozen woods of the north. It feels like a story from another life, a long and terrible dream that is finally fading in the morning light. He closes his eyes and lets the scent of the spring fill his senses. He is a soldier of easy company, a survivor of the long road, and he is finally, hesitantly, allowing himself to believe in tomorrow. The regime has crumbled, the winter has passed, and the end is waiting just beyond the next hill. He drifts into a deep and quiet sleep, wrapped in the warmth of the spring and the unwavering love of his brothers, ready to walk the final miles home. Sometimes, the hardest thing to believe in is the return of comfort. Imagine waking up, not to the sharp, biting alarm of a bugle or the heavy thud of a falling tree, but to a silence so profound it feels as though the world has forgotten how to make noise. You are lying very still, and the first thing you notice is the weight. It is not the heavy, damp weight of a wool blanket soaked in freezing rain, or the crushing pressure of gear strapped to your chest. It is a light weight. A soft weight. You open your eyes and see a ceiling of white plaster, intricate and clean, instead of the dark, interlaced branches of a pine forest. You reach out a hand, your fingers still rough and calloused from the winter, and you touch something you haven't felt in a lifetime. You touch a bedsheet. It is cool, crisp, and smells of lavender and mountain air. You move your legs, and instead of the resistance of mud or the crunch of frozen snow, there is only the yielding softness of a real mattress. For the young men of easy company, arriving in the high, jagged peaks of the Bavarian Alps felt like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel and into a brightly lit room. The transition was so sudden, so total, that it felt like a collective hallucination. One day they were walking through the ashes of a broken empire, and the next, they were winding their way up pristine mountain roads, where the air was so clear it tasted like cold water from a spring. They reached the town of Berchtesgaden, a place of gingerbread houses and flower boxes, nestled in the shadow of giants. Looming above them was the Kelstein house, the eagle's nest. It was a fortress of stone perched on the very edge of the sky, a place designed for a man who wanted to look down on the rest of humanity. But when the soldiers arrived, the eagle was gone. The nest was empty. The halls that had once echoed with the footsteps of those who sought to unmake the world were now filled with the quiet, dusty sunlight of a spring afternoon. If you were to walk through those rooms with them, you would see the bizarre, dreamlike luxury of it all. There were great fireplaces made of red marble, and long, heavy tables carved from ancient oak. There were cellars filled with thousands of bottles of the finest wines and cognacs, treasures stolen from every corner of the world, now sitting quietly in the dark. But the soldiers didn't move through the house with the heavy boots of conquerors. They moved with a quiet, bewildered reverence. They were boys from the coal mines of Pennsylvania and the farms of Oregon, and they found themselves standing in the most guarded sanctuary of their enemy. Picture a young sergeant sitting in a high-backed velvet chair. He rests his boots, still stained with the dirt of the road, on a rug that is softer than anything he has ever known. He holds a crystal glass in his hand, watching the amber light of the sun catch the liquid inside. He isn't thinking of the politics or the history. He is thinking of the sheer, absurd contrast of his life. Just a few weeks ago, he was boiling snow in a tin cup to stay alive. Now, he is looking out a window at a view that stretches across the borders of countries, a view of jagged, snow-capped peaks and deep, emerald valleys that seem to belong to a different planet. The silence of the mountains was different from the silence of the woods. In the woods, silence was a warning. Here, the silence was a healing thing. It was a peace that felt as ancient as the stone itself. The men spent their days in a kind of suspended animation. They lived in the grand villas and the elegant hotels of the valley. They learned, slowly and hesitantly, how to be human again. They learned how to sit at a table with a white tablecloth and use a silver fork. They learned how to linger over a meal without looking over their shoulder. In the quiet hours of the evening, they would gather on the terraces of their villas. The air would grow cool as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. They would sit in the shadows, the glowing tips of their cigarettes like tiny, wandering stars. They talked about the luxury as if it were a joke they were all in on together. They laughed about the softness of the pillows and the way the hot water in the tubs felt like a miracle against their skin. But beneath the laughter, there was a shared, quiet melancholy. They looked at the empty chairs beside them, thinking of the brothers who should have been there to see the view. They thought of the boys who had stayed behind in the green mazes of France and the white silence of the Ardennes. The luxury felt heavy because it was unshared. Every clean sheet, every glass of fine wine, was a reminder of what it had cost to get there. They were the survivors, the ones who had made it to the top of the mountain, and they carried the memories of the fallen like a quiet, invisible cargo. In one of the grand rooms, a soldier found a piano. He sat down and began to play, his fingers moving tentatively over the ivory keys. He didn't play a march or a song of war. He played a soft, wandering melody he remembered from a church social back home. The sound drifted through the open windows, floating out over the balcony and into the thin, mountain air. His brothers stopped what they were doing to listen. For a few minutes, the war was truly over. There were no maps, no orders, no fear. There was only the music, the mountains, and the feeling of being safe. It was a moment of profound, everyday heroism, the heroism of allowing oneself to feel peace again. The letters they wrote home during this time were filled with a sense of wonder. They tried to describe the beauty of the Alps, the way the clouds would snag on the mountain peaks, and the strange feeling of sleeping in a house that belonged to a ghost. A young man from the Midwest sat at a desk made of polished mahogany, writing to his mother. "I wish you could see this, Ma," he wrote. "It's like something out of a book. I'm staying in a house that's nicer than any hotel I've ever seen. The mountains go up so high you have to tilt your head back to see the tops. It's so quiet here you can hear your own heart beating. I think I'm starting to forget what the noise sounded like. I'm eating well, and I'm sleeping in a bed with real pillows. Don't worry about me. The road is almost at the end." He didn't tell her that he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, reaching for his rifle in the dark, his heart pounding because the bed felt too soft and the room felt too quiet. He didn't tell her that the luxury felt like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. He only told her about the light in the air. He wanted her to believe that he was already home, even if his body was still thousands of miles away. The kindnesses of these days were small and tender. A soldier might find a hidden stash of chocolate and divide it among his friends, ensuring everyone got a taste of the sweetness. Another might spend his afternoon helping an elderly woman in the village carry her groceries, finding a strange comfort in the simple, domestic task. They were reclaiming the parts of themselves that the war had tried to strip away. They were becoming neighbors and sons again. They explored the eagle's nest with a sense of curiosity. They stood on the great balcony where the leaders of the regime had once stood, and they looked out at the world. But they didn't see an empire to be conquered. They saw a world that needed to be mended. They saw the tiny, distant towns in the valleys, the smoke rising from the chimneys, the people going about their lives in the aftermath of the storm. Sitting there, high above the clouds, they realized that the eagle had built this place to be a monument to power, but in the end, it was just a house on a hill. The true power was not in the stone or the marble, it was in the resilience of the human spirit. It was in the boys who had climbed the mountain in Georgia and walked across the snowfields of Belgium. They were the ones who truly owned the view, because they had earned it with their blood and their brotherhood. As the days turned into weeks, the dreamlike quality of life in the Alps began to settle into a new kind of normal. They grew used to the sight of the mountains and the feel of the sheets. The edge of their exhaustion began to soften, like a jagged stone being worn smooth by a river. They spent their afternoons hiking through the meadows, picking wildflowers and breathing in the scent of the pines. They sat by the lakes, watching the reflection of the peaks in the still, blue water. They were waiting for the final word, the official end of the story. But in their hearts, the end had already arrived. The guns were silent, the enemy was gone, and the world was starting to turn again. On their final night at the Eagle's Nest, a group of men gathered in the Great Hall. They had opened a bottle of cognac that was older than they were. They sat around the red marble fireplace, the flames casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. They didn't talk about the battles. They didn't talk about the medals. They talked about the future. They talked about the lives they were going to lead when they finally stepped off the ship in New York. They talked about the houses they would build and the families they would start. "I'm going to be a teacher," one whispered, staring into the fire. "I want to help kids understand how big the world is." "I'm going back to the farm," another said. "I just want to see the wheat grow. I want to hear the wind in the corn." They were making plans for a world of peace, right there in the heart of the place where the war had been dreamed up. It was the ultimate victory. As the night deepened, they drifted off to sleep, some in the velvet chairs, some on the soft rugs. The mountain stood silent around them, a giant of stone and snow. The stars were bright and cold in the thin air, watching over the empty nest. The young soldier from Oregon lay in his real bed, his head resting on the lavender-scented pillow. He looked out the window at the silhouette of the peaks against the starlit sky. He felt the steady rise and fall of his own chest. He wasn't afraid of the dream anymore. He let himself sink into the softness, the luxury no longer feeling bizarre, but like a promise kept. He closed his eyes and let the silence of the Alps carry him away. He was a soldier of easy company, resting at the top of the world, waiting for the morning when he would finally begin the long walk down the mountain and all the way back to the porch he had never stopped dreaming of. The world did not end with a roar, it ended with the sound of a single bird singing in a valley that had finally stopped shaking. Imagine a morning where the air is so still you can hear the dewdrops sliding off the petals of mountain wildflowers. For nearly 3 years, the young men of Easy Company had lived with a constant, low-frequency hum vibrating in their very marrow, the sound of engines, the whistle of the wind through jump doors, the rhythmic thud of boots, and the jagged, unpredictable tearing of the air. It was a noise that had become their heartbeat. And then, in one soft, sun-drenched moment in a green valley beneath the peaks, that noise simply vanished. The silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. It was a thick, golden velvet that settled over the meadows, the winding dirt roads, and the stone houses with their flower boxes full of red geraniums. When the word finally came, not as a triumphant shout, but as a quiet, passed-around whisper, the men didn't cheer. They didn't throw their helmets into the air or fire their rifles at the sun. Instead, they stood exactly where they were, their hands hanging loosely at their sides, and they simply listened to the silence. If you were to look at a young soldier in that moment, leaning against a wooden fence post, you would see a face that was a map of everything he had endured. The soot of the woods and the dust of the road had been washed away, but there was a lingering shadow in his eyes that no amount of alpine sunlight could reach. He looked at his hands, those large, calloused hands that had dug into the frozen earth of Bastogne and gripped a cold rifle through the rains of Holland. He turned them over, palm up, staring at them as if they belonged to a stranger. For so long, these hands had been tools of survival, instruments of a terrible necessity. Now, suddenly, they were just hands again. They had nothing to do. There was no one left to fight, no more ground to take, no more dark corners to watch. The realization brought with it a profound, hollow emptiness. It was a complex melancholy that tasted like the cool mountain mist. For years, their entire identity had been forged in the white-hot heat of a shared purpose. They were the ones who went first. They were the ones who held the line. They were brothers in arms, bound by a singular, life-or-death mission. And in the space of a single breath, that mission was gone. The enemy had folded like a tired ghost, and the great machinery of the war had hummed to a stop. A strange, quiet grief began to settle into the spaces where the adrenaline used to live. They looked around at the pristine beauty of the valley, the emerald grass, the sparkling streams, the peaceful cows grazing with their rhythmic, clanking bells, and they felt like intruders from another world. They were creatures of the shadows and the mud, and this world of light and peace felt fragile, as if it might shatter if they spoke too loudly. In the small village squares, they saw the men they had been fighting. These were no longer the terrifying, faceless shadows from the woods. They were just men in gray wool, their shoulders slumped under the weight of a monumental defeat. They sat by the roadsides, their eyes fixed on the dirt, waiting for instructions on how to exist in a world where they were no longer soldiers. Picture a young paratrooper walking toward a well to fill his canteen. He passes a German soldier sitting on a stone wall. The German is older, perhaps the age of the American's father back in Ohio. Their eyes meet for a fleeting, crystalline second. In that look, there is no hate. There is only a deep, bone-weary recognition. They both know the smell of damp wool in a freezing trench. They both know the specific ache of a heart that hasn't seen home in years. The American reaches into his pocket, pulls out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, and offers one. The German takes it with a trembling hand and a nod so slight it is almost invisible. They stand there together in the morning light, two tired men sharing a match, the smoke drifting up toward the blue sky in a single, peaceful curl. In that small act of everyday heroism, the heroism of reclaiming one's humanity, the war truly ended for both of them. The letters home during these first few days of silence were the hardest to write. The pens felt heavy, the paper too small for the vast, swirling emotions in their chests. One boy sat on the grass beneath a cherry tree, the white blossoms falling around him like warm snow. He wrote to his mother, but he found he couldn't talk about the victory or the surrender. He wrote instead about the silence. "Dear Ma," he penned, his handwriting trailing off into the margins. "It is finally quiet. You wouldn't believe how quiet it is. I can hear the bees in the clover from 20 feet away. The sun is warm on my back, and I find myself just sitting here for hours, doing nothing at all. I think I forgot how to just be a person. I think I'm going to have to learn all over again." He didn't tell her that the silence made his ears ring. He didn't tell her that he felt a secret, terrifying fear of what he would do with all the time he now had. He didn't tell her that he felt a strange, lingering loyalty to the noise, because the noise was what his brothers had lived and died in. He just told her about the bees and the sun, trying to find his way back to the boy who had left the porch so long ago. The brotherhood, once a shield against the dark, became a sanctuary of reflection. They spent their afternoons sitting on the banks of the rushing mountain rivers, their boots tossed aside, their feet cooling in the glacial water. They didn't talk much. The need for constant communication, for warnings and instructions, had evaporated. Now, they communicated in the slow, easy language of survivors. They shared the last of their coffee, the steam rising into the crisp air. They looked at each other and saw not just comrades, but the keepers of a sacred and terrible story. They began to face themselves in the mirror of the valley's stillness. Without the distraction of the next jump or the next patrol, the memories they had pushed into the back of their minds began to drift forward, soft and persistent as the mountain fog. They remembered the faces of the boys who hadn't made it to the valley. They remembered the specific way a friend laughed, the way a sergeant tucked a letter into his helmet, the way a medic's hands moved in the dark. These memories were no longer sharp and jagged with the pain of immediate loss. They were becoming part of the permanent landscape of their souls. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks and the valley turned a deep, bruised purple, a group of men gathered on the porch of a small farmhouse they were using for quarters. Someone had found an old, dusty accordion in the cellar. He began to play a slow, wandering folk tune. The music was simple and a little out of tune, but it carried perfectly through the thin, still air. The men sat on the steps, their silhouettes dark against the glowing windows. They watched the stars come out, one by one, over the Alps. For the first time, they weren't checking the horizon for movement. They weren't listening for the sound of a distant engine. They were just men listening to music on a porch at the end of a long day. The silence in the valley was a healing thing, but it was also a crucible. It stripped away the armor they had worn for so long, leaving them vulnerable to the weight of their own history. They realized that they would never truly leave the war behind. They would carry the green mazes and the white woods and the shadows of the river within them forever. But here, in the quiet of the mountains, they were learning how to carry that weight with a gentle grace. They saw the resilience in each other. They saw the way a soldier would go out of his way to help a local farmer fix a broken fence, or the way another would spend his morning carving a small wooden toy for a village child who had lost everything. These weren't grand gestures, they were the small, quiet repairs of the human heart. They were the ways they told themselves that the world was still a place where kindness could grow. As the days of the first week of peace stretched on, the overwhelming emptiness began to fill with a new kind of purpose, the purpose of moving forward. They looked at the winding roads leading out of the valley and toward the sea, and they knew that the long road home was finally open. They felt a restless, fluttering anticipation, a desire to see the faces of their families, to walk down the streets of their hometowns, to find out who they would be when they were no longer the men of easy company. But in the quietest part of the night, when the only sound was the rushing of the river and the breathing of the men in their bunks, they knew they would always belong to this silence. They would always be the ones who had stood in the valley when the gun stopped. They would always be the boys who had faced the unimaginable and found their way back to a morning of birdsong. The silence was not just the absence of war, it was the presence of a hard-won peace. It was the space where they could finally forgive themselves for surviving. It was the valley where they could finally lay down the heavy, invisible burden of being heroes and simply be men again. As the moon rose over the peaks, casting a long, silver glow over the peaceful meadows, the young soldier on the farmhouse porch stood up and stretched his tired limbs. He looked at his brothers, sleeping or sitting in the shadows, and he felt a profound, quiet love for every one of them. They had walked through the dark together, and now they were standing in the light. He took a slow, deep breath of the cool mountain air, tasting the scent of the pines and the sleeping earth. The world was quiet. The valley was still. And for the first time in a very long time, he was not afraid of the silence. He was ready for the morning. He was ready for the road. He was ready to find out what lay beyond the end of the story. He turned and walked softly into the house, his footsteps light on the wooden floor. He lay down on his bunk, closed his eyes, and let the silence of the valley wrap around him like a soft, protective cloak. He drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, anchored by the knowledge that the noise was gone, the brothers were safe, and the long, beautiful silence of the rest of his life was just beginning. Home is no longer a word written on an envelope, it is a shore waiting somewhere beyond the silver mist of the morning. For the young men of easy company, the end of the noise did not mean the immediate beginning of the journey. Instead, it brought a long, strange season of waiting. They remained for a time in the high, quiet places of the world, nestled among the pines and the jagged peaks of the Alps. The war was over, the guns were cold, and yet they were still draped in the heavy wool and olive-drab canvas that had defined their lives for years. They lived in a beautiful, sun-drenched limbo, a state of suspended animation where the past was too heavy to carry and the future was almost too bright to look at. Imagine those slow, golden afternoons in the valley. The men played baseball in meadows that had once been forbidden ground. You could hear the sharp, wooden crack of the bat echoing off the stone mountainsides, followed by the joyful, boisterous shouts of boys who were finally allowed to be young again. They sat on the banks of crystal-clear lakes, watching the reflection of the clouds in the still water, their rifles leaning against trees like forgotten relics. But even in the play, even in the rest, there was a restless energy humming beneath the surface. They were like birds caught in a gentle breeze, their wings twitching, waiting for the one specific current that would finally carry them west. They spent hours cleaning their equipment, not for battle, but for the final inspection. They polished their brass and shined their boots until the leather mirrored the bright mountain sky. And they talked. They talked in low, murmuring tones about the things they had almost forgotten. They wondered if the corner drugstore still sold the same cherry phosphates. They wondered if the old oak tree in the front yard had grown tall enough to shade the porch. They wondered if the people back home would recognize the men who were coming back, or if they would only see the ghosts of the boys who had left. The mail still came, but the letters were different now. There was a frantic, joyful urgency in the handwriting from home. Their mothers wrote about the Victory Gardens being turned into flower beds. Their sweethearts wrote about the dresses they were saving for the day the ships docked. Reading these words, the soldiers felt a strange, dizzying disconnect. They were still here, in the shadow of the mountains, while their hearts had already crossed the ocean and were sitting at kitchen tables in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Oregon. Then came the time of the points. It was a strange and quiet reckoning. Each man held a slip of paper, a tally of his time in the dark and the cold, a mathematical measure of his sacrifice. For some, the numbers added up to a ticket home. For others, the waiting would continue. This was the beginning of the most bittersweet chapter of their story. The brotherhood, which had been a single, unbreakable cord through the fire, was beginning to unthread. They had survived the night together, but they would not all walk into the morning at the same time. Picture the night before the first group was set to depart. The barracks were quiet, filled only with the soft rustle of canvas and the metallic clink of buckles as bags were packed. There were no grand speeches. There were no medals handed out in the dark. Instead, there were the small, profound gestures of men who knew each other's souls. A sergeant, a man who had led through the white woods and the green mazes, sat on the edge of his bunk. Across from him sat his best friend, a boy who didn't have enough points to leave just yet. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about the luck of the draw. The sergeant reached into his pack and pulled out a small, silver lighter, a prized possession he had carried since England. He didn't say anything, he just reached across the narrow aisle and pressed it into his friend's hand. The friend looked at it, then up at the sergeant. In the dim light, their eyes met in a look of absolute, unshakable love. It was a handshake that lasted a lifetime. It was a silent promise, I am going ahead to check the way. I will wait for you on the other side. When the trucks finally arrived to carry the first group away, the village street was filled with a heavy, pregnant silence. Those who were staying stood along the road, their hands in their pockets, watching their brothers climb into the canvas-covered beds of the vehicles. There were quick, fierce embraces. There were names and addresses scribbled on the backs of matchbooks. And then, the engines roared to life. As the trucks pulled away, winding down the mountain road, the men in the back watched the figures of their friends grow smaller and smaller until they were just tiny dark dots against the vast, green landscape. They felt a soaring, incredible lightness in their chests, but it was tempered by a hollow ache. They were finally going home, but they were leaving a part of themselves behind in the hearts of the men who remained. The journey across the broken face of Europe was a surreal procession. They traveled in trains that moved slowly through the ruins of great cities, past twisted steel and shattered stone. They saw the people of the continent beginning to stir, clearing the rubble, planting seeds in the craters. They watched it all through the windows of the carriages, feeling like travelers in a dream. They were moving through a world that was trying to remember how to be peaceful, and they were trying to remember right along with it. Finally, they reached the port. The ocean was there, a boundless expanse of deep, shimmering blue that stretched out to the edge of the world. And sitting in the harbor, towering over the stone piers, were the great ships. To the soldiers, they didn't look like vessels made of iron and rivets. They looked like cathedrals of hope. The sensation of boarding was floating and ethereal. They walked up the long wooden gangplanks, their boots echoing with a hollow, rhythmic thud. As they reached the deck, they felt the first true breath of the sea, a sharp, salt-tinged wind that seemed to wash away the lingering scent of wood smoke and damp earth. They dropped their heavy bags onto the deck and leaned against the railing, staring out at the horizon. For the first few days at sea, the ship was a hive of restless, joyful energy. The men explored every inch of the decks, marveling at the scale of the world. But as the days turned into a week, and the coast of Europe vanished into the mist, a profound, collective quiet settled over the ship. They were truly between worlds now. Behind them lay the mountain in Georgia, the dark skies of Normandy, the frozen woods of Bastogne, and the silent valleys of the Alps. Ahead of them lay a world that had been frozen in their memories like a photograph. They spent their hours on the deck, watching the endless rise and fall of the gray-green waves. The rhythmic swaying of the ship was like a giant cradle, rocking them out of the mindset of the soldier. They began to shed the internal armor they had worn for so long. They stopped listening for the sound of engines in the sky. They stopped watching the shadows for movement. They let the vast, empty horizon heal the jagged edges of their nerves. In the quietest part of the night, when the only sound was the rushing of the water against the hull and the deep, low thrum of the ship's engines, the men would gather near the bow. They looked out into the darkness, searching for the first flicker of a light that wasn't a star. They talked about the porches. The porch had become a mythical destination, the ultimate finish line. They imagined the exact creak of the floorboards. They imagined the way the screen door would feel in their hand. They imagined the specific, beautiful ordinariness of sitting in a rocking chair with a glass of cold water, watching the sun go down over a street where nothing ever happened. One young man, leaning against the cold metal railing, felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear. He looked at his hands, illuminated by the pale moonlight. He wondered if he could ever truly go back to that porch. He had seen things that didn't belong in a quiet neighborhood. He had carried a weight that a rocking chair might not be able to hold. He whispered his fear to the man standing beside him, a friend who had been with him since the beginning. The friend didn't offer a platitude. He just kept staring at the water. "The porch isn't just a place, Joe," he whispered back, his voice barely audible over the wind. "It's the people on it. They don't need you to be the boy who left. They just need you to be there. We'll find our way back. One day at a time." The words were a quiet anchor. The young man took a deep breath of the salt air and let the fear drift away into the wake of the ship. And then, the moment arrived. It started as a rumor, a ripple of excitement traveling from the bow to the stern. Men scrambled to the railings, their eyes straining against the morning mist. At first, it was just a smudge on the horizon, a slightly darker line where the gray of the sea met the gray of the sky. But as the sun began to climb, the line sharpened. It became a coastline. It became buildings. It became home. As the ship glided into the harbor, a spectacular, overwhelming noise erupted. It wasn't the noise of war, it was the noise of life. Tugs whistled, sirens blared, and from the docks came the sound of thousands of voices cheering, a great, rising tide of human joy that reached out and pulled them in. The men stood at the railings, tears unashamedly streaming down their faces. They saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the water, her torch held high, a silent, green sentinel welcoming them back from the dark. They saw the crowds on the piers, a sea of waving hats and colorful dresses. They looked for the faces they knew, their hearts hammering a frantic, joyful rhythm against their ribs. The transition from the ship to the shore was a blur of motion and emotion. They walked down the gangplank, and for the first time in years, the ground beneath their feet did not feel like a battlefield. It was just the earth. It was the solid, familiar, peaceful earth of home. The long road to the porch was almost over. They boarded trains that fanned out across the country, carrying them toward the small towns and the big cities, toward the farms and the factories. As the landscapes of America rolled past the windows, the rolling hills of the East, the vast plains of the Midwest, the rugged mountains of the West, the men felt a strange, floating sensation. It was as if they were finally waking up from a long and terrible dream. One by one, they reached their stations. They stepped off the trains with their canvas bags, standing on platforms they had left lifetimes ago. They walked down streets that looked exactly the same, yet felt entirely different. Picture the young soldier from the ship walking down his own street. The sun is setting, painting the houses in a soft, amber glow. He sees the old oak tree. He hears the sound of a neighbor's radio through an open window. He reaches his house. He walks up the steps. He stands on the porch. He doesn't knock. He just stands there for a moment, feeling the wood beneath his boots, listening to the quiet. He looks out at the street, at the world that had been forgotten and found again. He is home. The road has ended. The brothers are scattered, the mountain is a memory, and the silence is finally, truly, peaceful. He reaches out and touches the screen door. He takes a slow, deep breath, smelling the familiar scent of home, the scent of cut grass and old wood and love. He opens the door and walks inside, leaving the war behind him in the shadows of the porch, ready to begin the rest of his life in the light. Time has a way of turning even the loudest thunder into the softest of whispers. If you were to sit on a quiet porch in the late afternoon, watching the long, golden shadows of autumn stretch across a freshly mown lawn, you might see an old man resting in a high-backed chair. His hair is the color of the morning mist, and his hands, once so steady and strong, now tremble just a little as he holds a lukewarm cup of tea. His eyes are soft, appearing perhaps a bit cloudy to a passerby, but if you looked closely, you would see they are not looking at the street or the trees. They are looking backward, through the layers of the years, to a world that was once vibrant with the colors of olive and steel. The boys of the mountain have become the grandfathers of the garden. The boots that once crunched through the frozen mud of the Ardennes now shuffle softly over carpeted hallways. The voices that once shouted warnings over the roar of transport planes now murmur gentle stories to children who sit wide-eyed on their knees. The transition was slow, as natural as the turning of the leaves. They came home, they hung their uniforms in cedar chests, and they stepped quietly into the lives they had fought so hard to find. They became mailmen, and teachers, and carpenters. They built houses, and they planted apple trees, and they watched their children grow tall in the sunlight of a world at peace. For many years, they didn't speak of the mountain. They didn't speak of the sky. The stories were tucked away in the deepest drawers of their hearts, protected by a layer of silence that was both heavy and sacred. They wanted the world to be simple. They wanted the morning to be just a morning, without the weight of the unknown. But as the hair turned to silver and the pace of life began to slow, the silence began to soften. It started with a phone call in the middle of the night, a voice from the past traveling across the wires. "I'm still here, Bill. Are you still here?" Those phone calls were the first gentle threads of a tapestry being woven back together. They began to find each other in the quiet corners of hotel lobbies and small-town diners. When they met, they didn't look like the legends the world was starting to call them. They were just men in comfortable sweaters and sensible shoes. They didn't talk about the tactical maneuvers or the grand strategies of generals. They didn't compare the ribbons pinned to their blazers. Instead, they talked about the sensory memories that had survived the decades. They talked about the specific, bitter taste of the water in a Dutch canal. They talked about the way a shared cigarette tasted in a foxhole when the world was white with snow. They talked about the boy who could always find a way to make them laugh when they were shivering so hard they couldn't hold their rifles. They talked about the kindness of a medic whose name they could no longer remember, but whose warm touch they would never forget. In those quiet reunions, they realized a profound and beautiful truth. The medals in the drawers, the certificates on the walls, the glory of the victories, none of it truly mattered. Those were things for the history books, things for the people who weren't there. For the men who had lived it, the only thing that held any weight was the person who had slept in the next foxhole. The only true treasure was the knowledge that they had not been alone. The brotherhood was not a thing of the past, it was a living, breathing sanctuary. They were the only ones who knew the shape of each other's shadows. They were the keepers of a language that didn't need words, a language of nods, and shared silences, and the gentle resting of a hand on a shoulder. They were anchored to one another by a love that was deeper than any ocean, a bond that had been forged in a fire so hot it had burned away everything that was not essential. Imagine one of these men sitting in his study late at night. The house is quiet, the family is asleep, and the only light comes from a small desk lamp. He reaches into a box and pulls out a creased, black and white photograph. The edges are frayed, and the image is fading, but he can still see the faces. He sees the boy from the coal mines, the boy from the Kansas farm, the boy from the city streets. They are all smiling, their arms draped over each other's shoulders, their eyes bright with a youth that seems impossible now. He traces the faces with a finger that is thin and worn. He doesn't see them as they were in that moment. He sees them as they are now, or as they were when they finally found their peace. He thinks of the letters they wrote, the secrets they shared, the private fears they whispered into the dark. He feels a sudden, sharp pang of longing, not for the war, but for the purity of that connection. He realizes that he spent the rest of his life looking for that same level of trust, that same absolute surrender to the welfare of another, and he knows he only found it once, on a mountain and in the woods. As the seasons of their lives moved into the deep winter, the footsteps began to fade. One by one, the chairs at the reunion stayed empty. The phone calls grew fewer. The voices that had once filled the barracks became echoes in the minds of those who remained. There was a quiet, dignified melancholy in these later years. They watched their brothers depart, not in a rush of noise, but in the gentle, drifting way that snow falls on a silent forest. They went to the funerals, standing tall despite the ache in their bones, listening to the lonely, haunting notes of a bugle playing across a green field. They didn't weep for the loss of a hero, they wept for the loss of a friend who knew what the rain smelled like in Normandy. Yet, even as the numbers thinned, the light of the company did not grow dim. It changed. It became a legacy of quiet resilience, a reminder that the human spirit is capable of enduring the unimaginable if it has a hand to hold. They taught their grandchildren that true strength is found in kindness, that the greatest act of bravery is to look out for the person standing next to you. They showed the world that a life built on a foundation of brotherhood is a life that can never truly be broken. In the very final years, the world reached out to them. They were invited to ceremonies, they were given more medals, they were thanked by people who weren't even born when the guns went silent. They accepted it all with a humble, slightly bewildered grace. They didn't feel like the monuments they were becoming. They still felt like the boys who were just trying to stay warm, the boys who were just trying to get back to the porch. Think of the last few men, the ones who saw the sun rise on a century they never expected to see. They sat in the quiet of their rooms, watching the world move at a dizzying pace, and they felt a profound sense of peace. They had done what was asked of them. They had carried the fire through the dark, and they had handed it off to a world that was bright and free. They were ready to let go. In their dreams, they went back to the mountain. Not as soldiers, but as spirits. They walked through the pine trees of Georgia, the air warm and sweet. They saw the fog lifting off the fields of France. They felt the cool, mountain breeze of the Alps. And in every place, they saw their brothers. They saw the faces that had been lost and found. They saw the smiles that had never faded. The last footsteps in the dew are not a sound of departure, but a sound of return. They are the quiet, rhythmic steps of a company finally coming back together. They are walking toward a horizon where there is no more cold, no more hunger, and no more shadows. They are walking toward a place where the tea is always warm, the beds are always soft, and the silence is a beautiful, eternal song. As you sit on your own porch tonight, listening to the crickets and watching the stars come out, take a moment to breathe in the peace. It is a peace that was paid for with the lives and the loves of those boys who became men in the dark. Their story is not a story of steel and maps. It is a story of the human heart, of the incredible, unbreakable thread of brotherhood that connects us all. Listen to the wind in the trees. It carries the whispers of 1,000 names. It carries the laughter of the barracks and the quiet promises of the foxholes. The company is still here, in the rustle of the leaves and the shimmering of the moonlight on the grass. They are in the small acts of kindness we show each other, in the quiet resilience of our own lives, and the way we reach out to hold a hand when the world grows cold. The old man on the porch finally finishes his tea. He stands up slowly, his movements a gentle, practiced dance with time. He looks out at the darkening sky one last time, a small, peaceful smile touching his lips. He is not afraid of the night. He knows that he is part of something that will never truly end. He turns and walks into the warm light of his home, his footsteps fading softly into the dew, leaving behind a world that is a little kinder, a little brighter, and a lot more loved because he and his brothers once walked through the mist together. Good night, easy company. The march is over. The dawn is here. And you are home at last.